Washington State's rainforests are among the most isolated wilderness areas in North America, where ancient trees block out the sun and constant rain creates a mist that swallows entire trails in seconds. Experienced hikers vanish here without explanation, and rangers refuse to patrol certain areas after dark for reasons they won't discuss. Tonight, you're going to hear 11 encounters from people who walked into these woods and discovered that some places don't let everyone leave. Welcome to Verified Fears. What would you do if you realize the trail you've been hiking for hours doesn't exist on any map? I've been hiking the Olympic National Park trails for 12 years, and I thought I knew every inch of the Hoh rainforest. I'm talking about the kind of familiarity where you can identify which section you're on just by the pattern of moss on the Sitka spruces, where you know exactly how many creek crossings to expect, and where your GPS is basically just a formality because your internal compass never fails. That confidence, that certainty I had in my abilities, is what almost killed me last October. The Hoh rainforest receives an average of 12 to 14 feet of rain annually, making it one of the wettest places in the continental United States. And on that particular morning, it was living up to its reputation. The rain wasn't heavy, just that persistent Pacific Northwest drizzle that seeps into everything, turning the forest floor into a sponge and reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. I'd planned a solo day hike along the Hoh River Trail. Nothing extreme. Just an 8-mile out and back to clear my head after a rough week at work. I've done this trail dozens of times, photographed it in every season, and even led groups through it for the local hiking club. The trailhead was nearly empty when I arrived around 7 in the morning, which wasn't surprising given the weather forecast. The first 2 miles were exactly as I remembered them, winding through those massive old-growth Douglas firs and western red cedars that tower 200 feet above you, their trunks so thick that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The Hall of Mosses section was as stunning as ever, with those big leaf maples draped in club moss creating these otherworldly cathedral-like spaces that make you feel like you've stepped into another era. Everything was normal, routine, exactly as it should have been. But then around the 3-mile marker, I noticed something odd. There was a trail junction I didn't remember, marked with a weathered wooden post that had an arrow carved into it, pointing northeast, away from the main trail. The wood looked old, genuinely aged by decades of weather, with that silvered patina you only get from years of exposure to rain and moss growth. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, and that's when I got my first real indication that something was wrong. My GPS showed the main Hoh River Trail clearly marked, but there was no junction, no side trail, nothing that corresponded to what I was seeing right in front of me. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct I developed over 12 years of hiking in these woods should have been screaming at me to stick to the known trail. But I convinced myself it was just an unmapped social trail, maybe something the park rangers used for maintenance access. The rain was getting heavier, and I rationalized that this trail might lead to a shorter loop back to the parking area. I've made a lot of stupid decisions in my life, but following that trail ranks near the top. The path was well maintained. That's what struck me immediately. The undergrowth was cleared back, fallen logs had been cut and moved aside, and the trail bed itself showed signs of regular use with packed earth and established drainage channels. For an unmapped trail, someone was clearly taking care of it. I hiked for what felt like 20 minutes, maybe 30, watching my GPS the whole time. According to the satellite tracking, I was moving parallel to the main trail, maintaining a consistent northeastern heading, but the distance readings were getting strange. My phone showed I'd traveled 0.3 miles from the junction, but I knew I'd covered at least a mile based on my pace and the landmarks I'd passed. The rain intensified until the forest around me disappeared into a wall of gray mist, the kind of complete visibility loss that can happen in seconds in the temperate rainforests of Washington. The canopy overhead was so dense that it created a strange twilight effect, even though it was mid-morning. And the sound of rain on 10 million leaves created this constant white noise that swallowed every other sound. I decided to turn back, but when I looked behind me, the trail I'd just walked looked different. The trees seemed wrong, their positions not quite matching my memory from just minutes ago. I checked my GPS again and felt my stomach drop. According to the screen, I was now 0.2 miles from the junction, even though I'd been walking steadily away from it for the last 5 minutes. I actually stopped and stared at the phone, watching the distance reading fluctuate between 0.2 and 0.4 miles, while I stood completely still. GPS errors can happen in old-growth forests, where the dense canopy interferes with satellite signals. But this was beyond normal interference patterns. That's when I saw the other hiker. He appeared out of the mist about 50 feet ahead, moving slowly down the trail toward me with his head down, focused on his footing. I felt a wave of relief because another person meant I wasn't crazy, meant this trail was real and used by other people. I called out to him, asked if he knew where this trail connected back to the main route. He looked up, and I saw his face clearly for just a moment before the mist shifted between us. He looked confused, genuinely disoriented, and his gear was wrong. Not wrong like he was unprepared, wrong like it was from another decade entirely. His backpack was one of those old external frame packs from the 70s or 80s, the kind you only see in vintage gear shops. And his rain jacket was a faded orange that had that particular weathering pattern you only get from years of continuous use. He opened his mouth to respond, but I couldn't hear his words over the rain. And then he just walked past me, continuing down the trail in the direction I'd come from. I turned to follow him, to try to communicate again, but he'd already disappeared into the mist. In the 3 seconds it took me to turn around, he'd vanished completely. I started walking faster now, back the way I'd come, but the trail felt wrong with every step. I passed the same massive Sitka spruce 3 times. I know I did because it had a distinctive burled growth pattern at chest height that looked like a screaming face. And each time I passed it, my GPS showed a different location. The 4th time I saw that tree, I started running. The panic that had been building in my chest finally broke through my rational mind. And I just ran through the rain and mist, following the trail as it wound between those ancient trees, my boots splashing through puddles and slipping on moss-covered roots. My GPS was useless now, showing me walking in circles even though I was moving in a straight line. The distance to the trailhead fluctuating wildly between 8 miles and 0.2 miles. I ran for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 15 minutes before I burst out into a small clearing and stopped dead. Sitting in the middle of the clearing was a tent, a small backpacking tent with a fly pulled tight against the rain. My tent. The exact same model and color as the tent I owned, set up in the precise way I always set it up with the door facing southeast and the guy lines at my preferred tension. But I hadn't brought my tent. This was a day hike. I walked closer, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. And that's when I saw the decay. The tent fabric was rotted, covered in moss and mildew, with holes eaten through the fly by years of weather exposure. The stakes were rusted, half buried in forest duff that had accumulated around them. This tent had been here for months, maybe years. I circled around it, afraid to touch it, and saw my name written on the stuff sack visible through the mesh door, written in my handwriting with the same silver Sharpie I used to label all my gear. Inside the tent, I could see a sleeping bag, my sleeping bag, rotted and covered in moss. A backpack that matched mine. A water bottle with my stickers on it. All of it decayed, all of it abandoned for what looked like at least a full season. I ran again, this time with no conscious thought, just pure animal panic driving me forward. I crashed through undergrowth, ignored the trail completely, and just moved in what I prayed was the right direction. The forest seemed to close in around me, the massive tree trunks appearing out of the mist like prison bars. The canopy overhead blocking out what little light penetrated the storm. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst out onto pavement, actual blessed pavement, and nearly got hit by a car on Highway 101. The driver honked and swerved, and I stood there in the middle of the road, gasping and shaking as rain poured down around me. I'd come out nearly 6 miles south of the Hoh River trailhead, in an area where there are no official trails connecting to the highway. When I finally made it back to my car and checked the time, it was just past 9:30 in the morning. According to my watch, I'd been in the woods for 2.5 hours. According to my phone's GPS log, I'd walked 17.3 miles in impossible circular patterns. I sat in my car, heater blasting, and pulled up every trail map I had of Olympic National Park. I searched satellite imagery, cross-referenced with Park Service records, and looked up historical trail information going back decades. There is no side trail at the 3-mile marker of the Hoh River Trail. There has never been a junction there. The area my GPS showed me walking through is marked on official maps as impassable old growth with no maintained trails of any kind. I reported what happened to the park rangers, showed them my GPS data, told them about the other hiker and the tent. They took my statement with the kind of careful attention that made me think I wasn't the first person to tell them a story like this. They asked if I'd seen trail markers, what condition they were in, whether I'd taken any photographs. I hadn't. My camera had stayed in my pack the entire time. One of the rangers, an older guy named Martinez, asked me if I'd felt compelled to follow the trail like I couldn't help myself. I told him no, it had been my choice, my stupid decision. He just nodded and said I was lucky, that most people who follow the unmapped trails don't find their way back to the highway. When I asked him what he meant, he just handed me back my GPS unit and told me to stick to marked trails from now on. I haven't been back to the Hoh rainforest since that day. My hiking boots are still in my closet. My pack still hangs in the garage, but I can't bring myself to use them, because 3 weeks after my experience, I was looking through old Pacific Northwest hiking forums and found a post from 2008. A man had reported getting lost on an unmapped trail in the Hoh rainforest. Described the same weathered trail markers, the same GPS malfunctions, the same feeling of walking in circles. He'd also mentioned seeing another hiker with old gear who didn't respond when spoken to. The man who wrote that post had included a photo of himself for identification purposes in case anyone had seen him on the trails. It was the same hiker I'd seen in the mist, wearing the same orange jacket, carrying the same pack. According to the forum, he'd made that post the day before he disappeared. They never found his body. Would you stay overnight in a remote fire lookout tower if you knew the last 3 rangers who worked there disappeared without a trace? I found out about the disappearances on my 3rd day of ranger training, sitting in a cramped office at the North Cascades headquarters while my supervisor, Dale Henriksen, reviewed my assignment paperwork with the kind of careful attention that should have been my first warning. I was 28 years old, fresh out of a forestry program at University of Washington, And this was my first real posting with the Forest Service after 2 years of seasonal work and grunt labor. Copper Ridge Lookout, elevation 6,000 feet, accessible only by a 5-mile trail that climbed through dense old-growth forest before breaking into alpine meadows, then finally reaching the small wooden structure perched on a rocky outcrop with 360-degree views of the North Cascades. Dale explained that I'd be doing a solo 10-day rotation, standard fire watch duty during the peak of fire season, nothing I hadn't trained for. What he didn't explain, at least not clearly, was why the position had been vacant for 8 months after 3 consecutive rangers had abandoned their posts mid-rotation without filing reports or returning their gear. I only learned about that part from another ranger named Sarah, who I met in the parking lot as I was loading my pack for the hike up. She was coming off a different lookout assignment, looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. And when she saw the Copper Ridge designation on my permit, she actually grabbed my arm. She told me that Marcus Chen had been the first to leave back in October, a veteran ranger with 15 years of experience who'd radioed in one night, saying he couldn't stay in the tower anymore, then hiked out in complete darkness, which is something you absolutely do not do on mountain trails. The second ranger, Jennifer Ortiz, lasted 3 days before she called for emergency evacuation, claiming equipment failure. Though when they retrieved the gear, everything was functional. The third ranger, whose name Sarah couldn't remember, never even radioed in, just left all his equipment in the tower and disappeared. His vehicle found abandoned at the trailhead 2 weeks later. Sarah asked me if Dale had mentioned any of this, and when I said no, she just shook her head and told me to trust my instincts. That if something felt wrong up there, I should leave immediately and not worry about my career or what anyone would think. The hike up to Copper Ridge took me about 4 hours, which was longer than I'd planned because I stopped frequently to photograph the incredible views, and because the altitude was affecting me more than I'd expected. The trail was well maintained but steep, gaining over 2,000 feet in elevation through sections of Douglas fir and mountain hemlock before opening into meadows filled with lupine and paintbrush. The lookout itself was exactly what I'd expected from the photos. A 14-foot square wooden cabin with large windows on all sides, a catwalk running around the exterior, and lightning rods jutting up from the peaked roof. Inside was basic but functional. A bed, a desk with radio equipment, fire-finding instruments, a propane stove, and shelves stocked with supplies. The previous occupant, presumably the ranger who'd abandoned his post, had left everything remarkably neat. His personal items gone, but the Forest Service equipment organized and clean. I spent the first few hours settling in, testing the radio, familiarizing myself with the fire-finding equipment, and watching the sun descend toward the jagged peaks to the west. The fog rolled in around 8:30 that first evening, which wasn't unusual for the North Cascades, where weather patterns can change within minutes, and clouds regularly settle into valleys and drape over ridges. What was unusual was how complete it was, how it didn't just obscure the view, but seemed to press against the windows, like something solid reducing my world to just the small, illuminated space of the lookout cabin floating in an ocean of gray nothing. I made dinner, wrote in the logbook, read for a while by lamplight, and tried not to think about what Sarah had told me in the parking lot. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the first voice. It came through the radio, crackling with static but clear enough, a woman saying my name. "Michael, Michael, can you hear me?" In a tone that suggested urgency. I grabbed the handset and responded, asking for identification and location, following protocol. The voice came back, still saying my name, but this time I realized it was my mother's voice, using the specific intonation she used when I was a child, and she was calling me in for dinner. My mother lives in Spokane, has never used a radio in her life and had no way of knowing my assignment location since I'd only received it 3 days ago. I checked the radio frequency, confirmed it was set to the Forest Service channel, and tried multiple times to raise dispatch at headquarters. Nothing. The radio remained silent for about 20 minutes. And then I heard my own voice coming through the speaker, having a conversation with someone I couldn't hear, discussing fire conditions and weather patterns using technical terminology I definitely knew, but didn't remember ever saying out loud in that specific combination. I turned the radio off completely, physically switched it off, and the voice continued for another 30 seconds before finally stopping. The silence that followed felt worse than the voices, heavy and expectant, like something was waiting to see how I'd react. I didn't sleep that night, just sat at the desk with every light in the cabin on, watching the fog press against the windows and occasionally seeing shapes move through it. Large forms that could have been trees or rocks, but that seemed to shift, positioned between one glance and the next. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the catwalk outside, the distinctive sound of boots on wooden planks, walking slowly around the perimeter of the cabin in a complete circle. I looked out each window as the steps passed, but the fog was too dense to see anything. And when the footsteps completed their circuit and stopped at the door, I heard a key sliding into the lock, metal scraping against metal. Even though I had the only key and it was sitting on the desk in front of me. The door didn't open, the lock didn't turn, but I could hear breathing on the other side of the door, slow and steady, for almost 10 minutes before it finally stopped and the footsteps retreated down the trail. By sunrise, the fog had lifted, revealing a spectacular morning with perfect visibility across the Cascades. Mount Baker visible to the northwest and Glacier Peak to the south. Exactly the kind of conditions that make fire watch duty feel like the best job in the world. I convinced myself that I'd experienced some kind of altitude-related hallucination, maybe combined with stress and the power of suggestion from Sarah's warning. I made coffee, ate breakfast, performed my scheduled weather observations, and scanned the visible forest for any signs of smoke. Everything was normal, professional, routine. Then, around noon, I heard my own voice calling from down the trail, shouting, "Help! I'm hurt! Please help me!" with exactly the right amount of panic and pain to sound genuine. I grabbed binoculars and scanned the trail, saw nothing, but the voice continued, getting closer, now adding specific details like, "I fell near the switchback. I think my ankle is broken. Please, Michael, I can see the tower. I just need help getting up the last section." Every instinct in my training told me to investigate, to help an injured hiker. But something about hearing my own voice beg for assistance triggered a primal fear response that overrode my professional obligations. I radioed headquarters, reported a possible injured hiker, gave coordinates, and waited. Dispatch confirmed they'd send a response team, but it would take at least 3 hours given the trail distance. The voice calling for help continued for another hour, sometimes using my voice, sometimes switching to other voices, including Dale's voice, giving me direct orders to come down and assist, including Sarah's voice, telling me specific details about her family that I had no way of knowing. When the actual rescue team arrived mid-afternoon, I watched them from the tower as they hiked the last quarter-mile to the lookout. 3 rangers moving together, and I counted them obsessively to make sure the number stayed at 3 and didn't change. They found no injured hiker, no signs of anyone on the trail except their own tracks and mine from the previous day. The team leader, a woman named Patterson, who I'd met briefly during training, asked me detailed questions about what I'd heard, taking notes with a kind of careful documentation that suggested she'd done this before. She told me that sound can do strange things at altitude, that wind patterns and temperature inversions can carry voices from valleys miles away, that radio interference from atmospheric conditions can create audio artifacts that sound like human speech. She was lying. I could tell by the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes, by the way the other two rangers kept scanning the tree line while we talked, by the way they positioned themselves between me and the trail, as if ready to intervene if I tried to run. That night, after the rescue team had left and I was alone again in the tower, the radio came on by itself despite still being switched off, and I heard all three of the previous rangers speaking at once, their voices overlapping as they described what I'd experienced, as they warned me not to trust what I heard, as they begged me to leave before it learned too much. The fog came back thicker than before, and this time I could see something moving in it, something large that circled the tower just beyond the range of visibility. And I realized that the breathing I'd heard at the door hadn't been trying to get in. It had been smelling me, learning me, memorizing everything about how I sounded and moved. I packed my essential gear in about 3 minutes, left everything else, and started hiking down in complete darkness with just a headlamp, breaking every safety protocol I'd ever learned. The entire 5 miles down, I heard voices, dozens of them, calling from the fog in the voices of everyone I'd ever known, using private information, inside jokes, intimate details that should have been impossible for anything to know. I reached my truck at 2 in the morning, drove straight to headquarters, and submitted my resignation before the office even opened. Dale tried to convince me to stay, said I'd just experienced normal psychological stress of solo duty, suggested counseling and a different assignment. I refused, and when I was cleaning out my temporary locker, I found notes hidden behind the shelves from the 3 previous rangers, each one describing the same progression of events, the voices, the fog, the thing that learned how to sound human by listening to us alone in that tower where no one else could hear it practice. The notes all ended the same way, saying that leaving was the right choice, that staying any longer would mean it would learn enough to follow us down, to call to us from anywhere using any voice we'd ever trusted. The Forest Service officially closed Copper Ridge Lookout 3 weeks after I left, citing structural concerns and budget constraints. But I've checked the trail reports online, and hikers still occasionally post about hearing voices calling from the fog up near the summit, hearing their own names spoken by people they know in voices that sound almost right, but not quite. And rangers still disappear in these mountains for reasons that never quite make sense in the official reports. I'm working landscaping now, staying in populated areas, never hiking alone. And I still can't use a radio without checking 3 times that it's actually off. What if the ancient trees around you weren't just alive, but aware and hunting? I've spent 20 years studying mycorrhizal networks and fungal communication systems in old-growth forests, and I thought I understood how trees interact with their environment. My doctoral thesis at Oregon State University focused on resource sharing between Douglas firs through underground fungal networks, the so-called wood wide web that allows trees to exchange nutrients, water, and chemical defense signals across vast distances. I'd published 14 papers on the subject, received federal grants from the National Science Foundation, and established myself as a credible voice in forest ecology. That credibility is gone now, along with my university position, my research funding, and any respect I had in the scientific community. What I discovered in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest last summer cannot be published in any legitimate journal, cannot be discussed at any academic conference, and cannot be explained by any existing model of plant behavior. But it happened, and the scars on my body prove it, even if no one believes my explanation for how I got them. The research site was a 170-acre remnant of ancient forest in an undisclosed location north of the Columbia River Gorge. featuring western red cedars over 9 feet in diameter, and Douglas firs reaching 8.5 feet across, some of them verified through core sampling to be over 800 years old. The Forest Service had granted me a 2-week solo research permit to document the mycorrhizal network density in undisturbed old-growth conditions, comparing it to secondary growth forests that had been logged and replanted. I set up my base camp in a small clearing surrounded by these massive trees, their canopies so dense that even at noon, the light that reached the forest floor was dim and filtered green through hundreds of feet of needles and branches. The ecosystem was pristine, exactly the kind of functioning ancient forest that's become increasingly rare in the Pacific Northwest. With a rich understory of ferns and devil's club, small streams cutting through thick beds of moss, and that particular smell of decay and growth that defines old-growth environments. The first 3 days of research went exactly as planned, collecting soil samples, mapping root systems using ground-penetrating radar, taking tissue samples from smaller plants to analyze their fungal colonization rates, and documenting the spatial distribution of dominant trees. I developed a standardized protocol over years of fieldwork that involved taking small core samples from trees, no more than 3 inches deep and 1/2 inch in diameter, enough to extract living tissue for genetic analysis without causing any real harm to specimens that had survived centuries of fires, storms, and diseases. On the 4th morning, I began noticing something unusual in my sample collection data. The trees I'd sampled on day 1, marked with small aluminum tags at chest height, had moved. Not their tags, the actual trees. I'd photographed each sample site with GPS coordinates embedded in the image metadata. And when I returned to collect follow-up samples, the trees were in different positions, shifted by 3 to 5 feet from their tagged locations. I initially attributed this to user error, assuming I'd marked the wrong trees or misread my GPS unit. But when I checked my photographs against the current positions, the discrepancy was undeniable. The massive fir I'd sampled, distinctive because of a large fire scar on its western side and an unusual double trunk formation 20 feet up, was now positioned 5 feet northeast of where it had been 3 days earlier. Trees don't move. This is fundamental biology. Their root systems anchor them permanently. But I had photographic evidence that contradicted this basic fact. I spent the entire afternoon resurveying my sample sites, using a laser rangefinder to verify distances between trees, and discovered that 12 of the 15 trees I'd sampled had changed position, always moving in roughly the same direction, roughly toward where I'd established my camp. That night, I stayed awake in my tent, listening to sounds I'd never heard in 2 decades of forest fieldwork, creaking and groaning that didn't match wind patterns, sounds of wood moving against wood. And underneath it all, a sort of rhythmic exhalation, like breathing, coming from the ground itself. I told myself it was root expansion responding to the water uptake. The trees are constantly adjusting their internal pressure systems. That old wood makes noise as it settles and responds to temperature changes. But when I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and look outside around 2 in the morning, I saw movement in the forest that couldn't be explained by any process I'd studied. The roots of the surrounding trees had emerged from the soil. Thick, ropey structures that normally stay buried now exposed on the forest floor. And they were moving with deliberate purpose, extending toward my camp and then retreating. Like something testing the ground, searching. I packed my essential research equipment and prepared to hike out at first light, abandoning 2 weeks of planned research. But when dawn came, I discovered that the trail I'd used to enter the research area was gone. The flagging tape I'd used to mark my route had been torn down. And more significantly, the trees along the trail corridor had shifted position enough to block the path. Their massive trunks now forming an impenetrable wall of wood that would require chainsaws and heavy equipment to clear. I tried 3 different potential exit routes that morning, using my GPS to navigate. But each time I found the forest had somehow rearranged itself to prevent egress. Trees positioned in ways that created natural barriers, forcing me back toward the center of the grove. By noon, I was fighting genuine panic, radioing for emergency extraction on my satellite communicator. And that's when I finally understood what I was dealing with. I'd set up my research samples in a rough circular pattern around the grove, and the trees I'd cored were all part of an interconnected mycorrhizal network that functioned as a single organism, a colony that shared resources and information through fungal highways connecting their root systems. By taking tissue samples, I'd essentially injured this organism, and it had responded not with passive chemical defense signals, but with active, coordinated, predatory behavior. The research documenting tree communication through mycorrhizal networks describes defense mechanisms like increasing tannin production or releasing volatile compounds to warn neighboring trees of pest attacks. What the research doesn't describe, what I've never seen published anywhere in the scientific literature, is what happens when an old growth network achieves enough complexity and age to develop something approximating distributed intelligence, or what that intelligence does to direct threats. The roots came for me that afternoon while I was attempting to force my way through the barrier of trees blocking the trail, climbing over and under massive trunks, cutting through undergrowth with my field machete. They erupted from the soil without warning, dozens of them, ranging from finger thickness to cables as thick as my thigh. And they wrapped around my ankles with shocking speed and strength. I fell hard, face first into the moss and duff, and immediately more roots snaked up my legs, around my waist, constricting like pythons. The pain was instant and excruciating, because these weren't smooth roots. They were covered in fine root hairs that penetrated my clothing and then my skin. Thousands of microscopic needles pushing into my flesh, seeking blood vessels, seeking access to my circulatory system. I could feel them moving under my skin, burrowing, spreading, and I realized, with absolute horror, that the mycorrhizal network was trying to colonize me the same way it colonized plants, establishing a physical connection to draw nutrients from my body. I cut myself free with the machete, hacking at the roots with hysterical strength, feeling them tear out of my skin as I severed the connections, leaving dozens of entry wounds leaking blood and clear lymphatic fluid. I ran then, crashing through undergrowth, ignoring the paths entirely, just moving in what I hoped was the direction of the forest boundary. And the entire grove seemed to pursue me. I could hear trees falling behind me, the massive crack of wood breaking. And when I glanced back, I saw them toppling deliberately, trying to block my escape or crush me, centuries-old giants sacrificing themselves to stop me from leaving. The forest floor heaved and buckled as root systems relocated, creating obstacles. And several times I fell into suddenly appearing pits where roots had withdrawn from the soil. My legs were streaming blood from dozens of penetration wounds, and I could feel something still moving under my skin. Something that hadn't been completely removed when I'd cut the roots away. I reached the forest boundary around dusk, emerging onto a clear-cut logging area that had been harvested 15 years ago and replanted with uniform rows of young Douglas firs. The ancient forest couldn't follow me there. The mycorrhizal network didn't extend into the plantation forest with its young trees and disrupted soil ecology. I collapsed on the logged ground and used my first aid kit to treat the wounds as best I could, pouring antiseptic into punctures that went disturbingly deep and wrapping pressure bandages around my legs to control the bleeding. When the Forest Service helicopter extracted me the next morning, responding to my emergency beacon, the paramedics couldn't understand my injuries, couldn't figure out how I'd sustained dozens of identical penetration wounds or why some of them showed signs of active growth. small thread-like structures visible in the deeper punctures that looked like fungal hyphae colonizing damaged tissue. The hospital in Portland removed 37 pieces of root material from my body over 3 days of surgery. Some of them embedded so deeply they'd reached muscle tissue, and the pathology report identified them as mycorrhizal structures, specifically ectomycorrhizae of the type that form symbiotic relationships with coniferous trees. My explanation for how they got there was recorded in my medical file and promptly dismissed as trauma-induced delusion or possibly hallucination caused by toxic plant exposure. The university placed me on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation, and when I insisted my account was accurate, they terminated my position for conduct unbecoming and pulled my research permits. The Forest Service closed my research site, citing concerns about hazardous terrain and unstable trees, and refused to grant access to any independent investigators who might verify my findings. I've spent the last 8 months recovering physically while my reputation and career disintegrate. And I've watched my tissue biopsy samples for any sign of continued fungal growth, terrified that the network established enough of a connection to track me somehow, to call me back. I've documented everything, maintained my field notes and photographs, preserved tissue samples in violation of university property rules. Because I know what I experienced was real even if no one in the scientific establishment will acknowledge it. There are forests in the Pacific Northwest that have been growing undisturbed for so long that they've developed beyond anything our current models of plant behavior can explain. Ecosystems that function as single organisms with emergent properties that include awareness, memory, and defense strategies that actively target perceived threats. We think of ancient forests as resources to be studied, managed, harvested. But some of them are old enough to have their own perspective on the relationship. And they've had centuries to develop very effective methods of protecting themselves from anything that tries to harm them. The scars on my legs are permanent, thin white lines where roots penetrated deepest. And sometimes at night, I swear, I can still feel something growing beneath them, spreading through my tissues in patterns that match mycorrhizal colonization, waiting for me to return to the forest so it can finish what it started. Could you trust your own memory if you kept waking up in different parts of the forest with hours missing? I run ultramarathons, the 100-mile kind where you're moving for 24 hours straight through mountains and wilderness, where your body breaks down and your mind plays tricks and you have to push through anyway. I've completed 14 ultras in the last 4 years, qualified for Western states twice, and maintained a training schedule that has me covering 70 to 80 miles per week, regardless of weather, terrain, or how my body feels about it. Running defines who I am, gives structure to my life, and provides the only reliable way I've found to quiet the constant anxiety that's been with me since childhood. When you're 20 miles into a mountain run, focused entirely on foot placement and breathing and forward progress, there's no room left for worry about bills or relationships or career stress. That clarity, that singular focus, became an addiction, and I built my entire routine around protecting it. Every morning at 5:30, I'd run the coastal trails near Cape Flattery in Washington, the northwestern tip of the continental United States, where the Pacific Ocean crashes against rocky cliffs and the fog rolls in thick enough to cut with a knife. The blackouts started in early September, subtle at first, just moments of disorientation where I'd realize I'd covered more distance than I remembered running or found myself on a different section of trail than I'd intended. I attributed it to that zone-out state that happens during long runs, where your conscious mind disengages and you're operating on autopilot, your body maintaining pace and navigating terrain while your thoughts drift elsewhere. Every serious runner experiences this. Those miles that disappear because you were thinking about something else or because your brain just stopped recording the repetitive motion of feet hitting dirt. But by mid-September, the episodes were becoming harder to dismiss. I'd start my run on the main Cape Flattery Trail, a simple 3/4-mile path through coastal forest to the viewing platforms overlooking Tatoosh Island. And I'd come back to awareness 5 miles inland with no memory of how I got there or why I deviated from my planned route. My Garmin fitness tracker recorded everything. That's what these devices do. They log every mile, every elevation change, every heartbeat, creating a comprehensive data record of your training that you can analyze to improve performance. I started obsessively checking the data after each run, trying to piece together what happened during the lost time. And that's when I noticed the speed anomalies. On September 18th, according to my tracker, I'd covered 13 miles in 47 minutes, which would put my pace at around 3 minutes and 30 seconds per mile, faster than the world record marathon pace. Sustained for over 40 minutes through forest trails with roots, rocks, and significant elevation change. That's not humanly possible, not even close. But the GPS log showed a clear path. The elevation data matched the terrain, and my heart rate during this impossible run was recorded at a steady 130 beats per minute, exactly my normal easy-pace heart rate. I assumed it was a GPS malfunction, the kind of error that happens when satellite signals bounce off surfaces or get blocked by dense tree canopy, creating false readings and phantom distances. I'd experienced GPS drift before on mountain runs, where the trackers showed me cutting straight across valleys I'd actually run around. But this was different because the path it recorded was following actual trails, just at speeds that violated basic physics. I posted about it in an ultra-running forum, included screenshots of my data, and got the responses I expected. People saying my tracker was malfunctioning, suggesting I try a different device, joking about me secretly being superhuman. Nobody took it seriously. And honestly, I didn't want to take it seriously either, because the alternative was confronting the fact that I was losing time, losing memory, and operating without conscious control for increasing periods during my daily runs. The morning of October 3rd was when everything changed, when I could no longer pretend this was just equipment failure or harmless dissociation. I started my run at 5:30 as always, the fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The kind of coastal Pacific Northwest fog that turns the forest into a gray void where sounds are muffled and directions become meaningless. I remember running the first quarter mile of the Cape Flattery Trail, the familiar boardwalk sections that protect the muddy areas, the slight descent toward the coast. Then nothing. My next clear memory was sitting on the ground in complete darkness, my headlamp illuminated, surrounded by old-growth trees I didn't recognize, my legs covered in mud and scratches, my running shoes shredded like I'd been scrambling over rocks. I checked my watch and felt my stomach drop. It was 9:45 p.m., more than 16 hours after I'd started my morning run. And according to my tracker, I'd covered 63 miles. The GPS log was insane, showing me running in massive loops through the Olympic National Forest, covering trails I'd never been on, reaching areas that required hiking permits and were miles from any road access. My average pace for 63 miles was 7 minutes and 42 seconds per mile, which is a respectable marathon pace, but utterly unsustainable for that distance without aid stations, nutrition, or any conscious plan. My heart rate had remained eerily consistent throughout, never spiking above 140 beats per minute despite the distance and terrain, never dropping below 120 even during what should have been rest periods. I tried to stand and nearly collapsed. My legs were destroyed, muscles cramping, blisters on top of blisters. But the pain felt distant somehow, like it was happening to someone else's body. I used my phone's GPS to figure out where I was, somewhere off Highway 112 about 8 miles southwest of Nia Bay, and started the painful process of hiking back to civilization through the darkness. It took me 4 hours to reach the highway, and during that entire time, I kept finding evidence of my passage. Muddy footprints matching my shoes, broken branches at head height where I'd pushed through undergrowth, places where I'd clearly stopped for extended periods based on the disturbed ground and the GPS track showing stationary points. At one of these stopping points, I found something that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped my phone. Scratched into the bark of a massive Sitka spruce, carved deeply with what must have been a rock or stick, were coordinates in my handwriting, numbers I recognized as latitude and longitude. I entered them into my phone, and the location they pointed to was deeper in the forest, another 6 miles northwest, in an area that showed no trails on any map, just a blank green space marked as impassable old growth. Below the coordinates was a single word, also in my handwriting, carved with the same desperate force. Come. I didn't go to those coordinates. I walked to Highway 112 and hitched a ride back to Nia Bay, where my truck was still parked at the Cape Flattery trailhead, untouched after sitting there for 16 hours. I drove home to Port Angeles, took the hottest shower I could stand, and tried to process what had happened. The rational explanations were all medical: a seizure disorder, a brain tumor, some kind of dissociative fugue state brought on by overtraining and stress. I made an appointment with a neurologist, went through an MRI, had blood work done, endured neurological testing that found absolutely nothing wrong with me. The doctor suggested I'd experienced a severe episode of exercise-induced dehydration and low blood sugar, maybe combined with mild heat stroke despite the cool, foggy conditions, and recommended I take a break from running. I nodded and agreed, and had no intention of following that advice, because running was the only thing I had, the only thing that made sense, and the idea of stopping felt like death. I tried to run again on October 7th. Same time, same trail, determined to maintain control, to stay conscious and aware of every step. The fog was back, rolling in from the Pacific in those dense gray waves that characterize fall mornings at Cape Flattery. I made it half a mile before I felt it starting. That pulling sensation, like something ahead of me on the trail was exerting a gentle but insistent gravitational force, calling me forward, promising relief from the constant anxiety that running normally quieted. I stopped, turned around, started running back toward the trailhead, and found myself running deeper into the forest instead, my body moving with fluid efficiency while my conscious mind screamed at my legs to stop, to turn around, to regain control. I was a passenger in my own body, feeling every sensation, aware of every movement, but completely unable to influence my actions. Watching through my own eyes as I ran faster than I'd ever run before. Following trails I'd never seen, moving towards something I couldn't name but somehow knew was waiting. I ran for 7 hours straight. My watch recorded 29.4 miles at an average pace of 5 minutes and 53 seconds per mile over technical terrain that should have required careful attention and frequent walking breaks. When I finally regained control, really regained it with my own will operating my limbs, I was standing in a small clearing surrounded by trees so old and massive they had to be 500 years or more, their trunks disappearing into the fog above. In the center of the clearing was a cairn, a deliberate stack of stones about 4 feet high, and scattered around its base were running shoes, dozens of pairs of them, all weathered and decayed by exposure to rain and time. I recognized 3 of the brands and models. They were popular among ultra-runners, the kind of shoes you see at every race start line. But they'd been here for months or years based on the moss growing on them and the way the materials had degraded. I added my own shoes to the collection because I somehow knew that's what I was supposed to do, what everyone who made it this far had done. And then I ran back to the trailhead in my socks, cutting my feet on rocks and roots, but maintaining perfect form, perfect pace. My body operating with an efficiency that felt both natural and utterly foreign. The coordinates I'd carved in the tree during my first blackout led to that clearing. I verified it when I got home and checked the GPS location. And I found 3 other trees on that initial lost 16-hour run where I'd carved the same message. Come. Each one pointing toward the cairn like directional markers. I haven't run in fog since then. Haven't run the coastal trails at all. But the pull is getting stronger, manifesting even on clear days, even on roads far from any forest. My fitness tracker shows runs I don't remember taking. Nighttime excursions where I apparently got out of bed, got dressed, and covered 10 or 15 miles before returning home and climbing back into bed with no conscious memory of the entire event. The GPS tracks all lead in the same general direction, back toward that clearing, and each time I check the cairn location on satellite imagery, I swear there are more shoes visible around the base. Fresh ones, colorful ones that weren't there before. I found a forum thread from 2 years ago, buried deep in an ultra-running community site, where a runner from Bellingham described similar experiences. Blackouts during foggy runs, impossible speeds, recorded on their tracker, waking up miles from where they started. They posted about finding a clearing with a cairn and old running shoes, asked if anyone else had experienced something similar, and then never posted again. Their profile shows their last activity was the day after they described finding the clearing, and their final post was edited to add just 2 words: "It's calling." I've tried to contact them through the forum's messaging system, but gotten no response. And when I searched for race results with their name, they haven't finished a race or appeared at a start line in 23 months. I'm writing this at 3 in the morning because I can't sleep. Because I can feel it pulling at me even now, that gentle, insistent call that promises something I can't quite name but desperately want. My running shoes are by the door, and I know that if I put them on and step outside, I'll run straight back to that clearing. No hesitation, no conscious decision. Just fluid motion through the darkness until I'm standing at the cairn again. The rational part of my mind says I should move away from the coast, should stop running entirely, should do whatever it takes to break this connection. But the part of me that needs to run, that defines itself through movement, wants to surrender to it completely. My Garmin is charging on my desk, showing my training calendar for the next 12 weeks, and every scheduled run route has changed itself to lead back toward those coordinates. Every workout modified to take me closer to that clearing where the shoes collect and the fog never lifts, and something waits that understands what runners need better than we understand it ourselves. What would you do if you found the missing hiker you were searching for, but they begged you not to bring them back? I've been volunteering with Snohomish County Search and Rescue for 5 years, responding to an average of 70 missions per year, everything from lost day hikers who wandered off trail to technical rope rescues on vertical cliff faces to body recoveries that nobody talks about afterward. You develop a certain professional detachment in this work. Learn to manage your emotions so you can function effectively during 12-hour searches through freezing rain, or when you're the one who has to tell a family that we found their loved one. But it's too late. I'm good at my job, certified in wilderness first aid, trained in lost person behavior and statistical search theory, and I've never lost anyone on my watch, never had a search where we didn't eventually bring someone home. That record ended on November 14th in the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, when we found 8-year-old Connor Matthews alive and unharmed after 3 days missing. and I made the decision to let him go back into the woods instead of bringing him to his parents, who were waiting at base camp. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A child missing from a family camping trip in the wilderness area near Marble Creek, about 40 miles northeast of Everett, in some of the most rugged terrain in Washington state. Connor had wandered away from the campsite around 4 in the afternoon on Saturday, while his parents were setting up their tent, just walked into the trees and didn't come back. The family searched for 2 hours before calling 911, and by the time our team assembled and hiked into the area, it was full dark and starting to rain, the temperature dropping into the 30s. We had 42 volunteers that first night, working in teams of 3 with dogs and thermal imaging equipment, following the protocols for lost child searches that prioritize speed over caution because hypothermia can kill in hours under these conditions. The statistical probability models suggested Connor would be within 2 miles of the last known point, probably near a linear feature like a creek or trail edge, and almost certainly immobile after the first night, too cold and scared to keep moving. We searched for 72 hours straight, rotating teams every 12 hours, expanding the search radius when the initial probability areas turned up nothing. Connor's parents stayed at base camp, the mother oscillating between desperate hope and complete breakdown, the father maintaining a rigid control that was somehow worse to watch than open grief. They'd brought photos of Connor, a small blonde kid with a gap-toothed smile, wearing a red jacket in the picture that we were all scanning the forest for. That bright splash of color that would mean we'd found him in time. By day 3, the incident commander was starting to discuss transitioning from rescue to recovery, the unspoken acknowledgement that a small child doesn't survive 3 nights in near-freezing temperatures without shelter or food. I was on the day shift Wednesday morning, searching a drainage area about 3 miles from the campsite with 2 other volunteers, when I heard the voice. It was a child's voice, high and clear, calling out, I'm okay, don't worry about me," with the kind of sing-song quality that immediately struck me as wrong. Kids who've been lost and terrified for 3 days don't sound cheerful. They sound traumatized. And they definitely don't volunteer reassurance to searchers they haven't even seen yet. I radioed my position to base and moved toward the voice, my partners flanking me. And we found Connor sitting on a fallen log in a small clearing, looking clean and dry and completely uninjured despite 3 days in the wilderness. He was still wearing the red jacket from the photo, but it wasn't muddy or torn, and his jeans and sneakers looked like he'd just put them on that morning. He smiled when he saw us, a too wide smile that didn't match his eyes, and said, "You should go back now. They're worried about you at the camp," in a flat tone that made my skin crawl. I approached slowly, using the gentle, non-threatening body language we're trained to use with traumatized children, and started my standard found person protocol, checking for injuries, asking about pain or discomfort, trying to establish his mental state. Connor answered every question with precise adult phrasing, saying he was experiencing no physical distress and had adequate shelter and nutrition in vocabulary that no 8-year-old would naturally use. His pupils were dilated despite the bright morning light filtering through the trees, and when I touched his hand to check his pulse, his skin was cold. Not hypothermic cold, but the ambient temperature cold of something that isn't generating its own heat. I pulled back instinctively, and that's when he grabbed my wrist with shocking strength and said in a voice that wasn't quite his own, "Please don't take me back. They'll be angry if you take me back. They saved me, and I have to stay." My partners had moved closer, and one of them, a veteran named Garcia with 10 years of SAR experience, pulled out his radio to call in the find, but Connor screamed, No, don't call them," with genuine terror in his voice, the first real emotion I'd seen from him. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face, begging us to leave him alone, saying he was safe here, and if we took him back to his parents, something bad would happen, something he couldn't explain, but that he knew with absolute certainty. I should have ignored him, should have followed protocol and carried him out of there regardless of his protests. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at me. Something that wasn't fear of the woods or fear of being lost, but fear of what would happen if he left. Garcia made the call anyway, reported that we'd found Connor alive and responsive, and within minutes, Base was celebrating. And I could hear the mother's cry of relief coming through the radio speaker clear enough to break your heart. Connor went quiet then, eerily still, staring at something over my shoulder with wide eyes. I turned to look and saw nothing, just trees and undergrowth and the typical forest landscape. But Connor was backing away from us, shaking his head, saying, they're here, you shouldn't have called, now they have to come too," in a whisper that barely carried. The forest around us had gone silent, that complete absence of sound that every experienced outdoors person recognizes as wrong. No birds, no wind, no small animals moving through the brush. Garcia and our third team member, a newer volunteer named Sarah, were both looking around now, sensing something off, hands instinctively moving to the emergency whistles on their chest straps. I saw them then, or at least I saw movement, shapes between the trees that were almost but not quite human-sized, moving with a coordination that suggested intelligence. Connor ran, just bolted back into the forest with speed that shouldn't have been possible for a child who'd supposedly been lost without food for 3 days. I ran after him on pure instinct, leaving my partners behind, crashing through undergrowth and jumping obstacles, and he was always just ahead of me, that red jacket flashing between trees. I followed him for what felt like miles, but was probably only a few hundred yards. And then he stopped in another clearing, this one containing structures that made my mind rebel against what I was seeing. They were shelters, dozens of them, built from branches and moss and forest debris, but constructed with precision that indicated tool use and planning. And scattered among the shelters were items that didn't belong there. A child's backpack, hiking boots in various sizes, a jacket that I recognized from a missing persons case 3 years ago. All arranged carefully, like someone was maintaining a collection. Connor turned to face me, and his expression was pleading, desperate as he said, "They found me on the first night when I was cold and scared. And they brought me here and gave me food and kept me warm, and they said I could stay forever and never have to go to school or follow rules or do anything I didn't want to do." He was speaking faster now, words tumbling over each other, explaining that there were others here, other children who'd been saved over the years. And they all lived together and took care of each other, and the things in the forest protected them from anyone who tried to take them back. I asked him if he wanted to see his parents, and he said no with such vehemence that I actually stepped back, said they didn't understand him, said they were always angry about his grades and his behavior, and here nobody was ever angry. Here he could just be. The shapes were closer now. I could see them more clearly in my peripheral vision, and they were wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Proportions slightly off, movement too fluid. And I knew with absolute certainty that if I tried to force Connor to come with me, those things would stop me. He must have seen the decision forming on my face because he smiled, his real smile this time, the gap-toothed grin from the photo, and said, "Thank you for understanding." I asked him if he was really okay, if he was being hurt or forced to stay. And he shook his head, said he'd never been happier, that this was where he belonged. I made him promise to stay visible, to let me see him one more time to confirm he was still safe. And he agreed. Said I could come back in a week and he'd meet me at this clearing. I hiked back to where I'd left my partners, and they were frantic, calling my name, about to radio in that I'd gotten separated. I told them I'd lost Connor in the thick undergrowth, that he'd slipped away, and we needed to expand the search in a different direction. We searched for another 6 hours, going through the motions, and when we finally called off the active search at dark, I had to watch Connor's mother collapse when we told her we'd briefly had him, but lost him again. The incident commander scheduled a full-scale search for the next day, with additional resources from King County and specialized tracking teams, and I volunteered for every shift, making sure I was the one searching the areas near that clearing. I went back to the clearing alone on the 7th day, hiking in before dawn with a pack full of supplies, energy bars, and warm socks and a fleece jacket in Connor's size. He was there waiting, looking healthy and clean. And he accepted the supplies with genuine gratitude, said some of the other kids would appreciate the extra clothes. I asked how many others there were, and he said he didn't know exactly, maybe 6 or 7 currently. But more had come and gone over the years, some choosing to eventually leave and integrate back into normal life with stories about being lost that no one quite believed. I asked if he'd ever want to leave, and he said maybe someday, but not yet. Not while his parents were still looking for him with that desperate intensity that made him feel guilty for wanting freedom. I've been back 4 times now, bringing supplies, checking on him, and each time he seems more settled, more genuinely content than most kids I see in normal circumstances. The official search was called off after 2 weeks. Connor's case filed as a tragic, unsolved disappearance, one of roughly 1,200 search and rescue missions per year in Washington state that don't end with a rescue. His parents still come to the trailhead sometimes, still walk the paths calling his name, and I see them occasionally when I'm heading out for my unofficial welfare checks. I should feel guilt about what I've done, about the choice I made to respect an 8-year-old's agency over the grief of his parents. But every time I see Connor in that clearing, smiling and healthy and free, I know I made the right decision, even if it's one I can never tell anyone about. The things that protect the children are still there. I see them every time I visit, watching from the tree line, and I've come to understand that they're not predators or monsters, but something else entirely. Something that offers sanctuary to children who need it, who can't survive in the world we've built for them. I don't know what they are or what they want in return for their protection, but Connor and the others seem to know instinctively, seem to have made a bargain that works for them. I keep searching on other missions, keep bringing lost hikers home, keep maintaining my perfect record on every case except the one that matters most. And I live with the weight of knowing that somewhere in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, there's a child I chose not to save, because sometimes rescue means taking someone away from the only place they've ever felt safe. Would you investigate an abandoned logging camp if you heard the sounds of chainsaws and men shouting from a site that's been closed for 40 years? I left the timber industry in 2019 after watching my best friend die in a rigging accident at a clear-cut site outside Republic, Washington. His body crushed when a cable snapped and sent a 1,000-pound log rolling downhill directly into him. I was standing 30 feet away, close enough to hear the cable part with that distinctive crack that every logger recognizes as the sound that precedes catastrophe. Close enough to see his face in the half-second before impact when he knew exactly what was about to happen and couldn't move fast enough to avoid it. The industry's safety statistics will tell you that logging is the most dangerous civilian occupation in America, with a fatality rate of 100 per 100,000 workers annually, 25 times higher than the national average. But those numbers don't capture the reality of watching someone you grew up with reduced to broken meat because a piece of equipment failed or because someone made a split-second error in judgment. I walked off the job that day, went back to school, got certified in environmental science, and now I work as an independent consultant documenting illegal logging operations and environmental violations on public lands. It's safer work, quieter work, and it lets me use my knowledge of the timber industry while maintaining enough distance that I can sleep at night without seeing that cable snap over and over again. The assignment that brought me to the Colville National Forest was straightforward. Document suspected illegal cutting in a restricted section near the Canadian border, where satellite imagery showed fresh logging activity in areas that hadn't been approved for harvest. The Colville is one of the last major national forests in Washington, with significant old-growth stands. Over 1.1 million acres of dense coniferous forest that's been the center of ongoing battles between conservation groups and timber companies for decades. I'd worked this forest back in my logging days, knew the geography and the roads, understood which areas were designated for sustainable harvest and which were protected. The coordinates I'd been given were about 15 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by deteriorating logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years, deep in a section that had been closed to commercial activity since the early 80s. I reached the general area around noon on a Wednesday in early November, the forest silent except for wind in the pines and the occasional call of ravens. And I immediately noticed something wrong with the tree line ahead. There was a gap in the canopy where mature growth should have been continuous, and as I got closer, I could see stumps, dozens of them, fresh cuts showing yellow sapwood that indicated recent harvesting. But the equipment wasn't right. The cut patterns weren't consistent with modern chainsaw work, and there was no sign of the heavy machinery that contemporary logging operations require. I followed the cut corridor deeper into the restricted zone, and that's when I heard the first chainsaw, that distinctive two-stroke engine whine echoing through the trees, coming from somewhere ahead and to my left. I moved toward the sound, stepping carefully, camera ready to document whoever was operating illegally in this closed area. And the forest opened into a complete logging camp, buildings and equipment and infrastructure that shouldn't exist here. There were 3 bunkhouses, a mess hall, a maintenance shed, all constructed from rough-cut lumber with that weathered gray patina that comes from decades of exposure. And parked around the structures were vehicles and machinery that made my breath catch in my throat. They were period vehicles, trucks and loaders, and a massive yarder from the 70s. The kind of equipment I'd only seen in historical photographs and logging museums. All of it looking functional and recently used with fresh mud on the tires and sawdust around the machinery. The chainsaw sound was louder now, multiple saws running simultaneously, and I could hear men's voices calling to each other in the professional shorthand that loggers use to coordinate dangerous work. I walked into the clearing properly and saw them. A full crew of maybe 15 men working a section of massive old-growth Douglas firs about 200 yards from the camp buildings. They were dressed in period clothing, faded jeans and flannel shirts, and those old orange hard hats from the 70s. And they were using techniques and equipment that the industry had abandoned decades ago for safety reasons. I watched as 2 fallers worked on dropping a tree that had to be 6 feet in diameter, using a massive 2-man chainsaw that required synchronized operation. The kind of saw that contributed to the horrific injury rates before modern equipment standards were implemented. The tree came down with that ground-shaking impact that never stops being impressive no matter how many times you witness it. And the crew immediately moved in to limb and buck the trunk, their movements practiced and efficient. I called out to them, identified myself as an environmental consultant, asked for their permits and authorization to be operating in this restricted area, and not one of them acknowledged my presence. They continued working, chainsaws screaming, shouting instructions to each other, moving around me like I wasn't there. I walked directly up to the closest worker, a young guy who couldn't have been more than 25, and put myself in his line of sight as he prepared to make a cut. He looked through me. Not past me, but genuinely through me like I was transparent, and fired up his saw, the bar passing within inches of my body as he cut into the log he was bucking. I stumbled backward, and that's when I saw the radio mounted on a stump near the landing area, one of those old CB units from the 70s. And it was broadcasting continuous chatter and voices that included the men I was watching. The radio conversation was specific. Technical discussion of the day's cutting plan and equipment status and weather conditions. And I heard one voice saying, "November 7th, 1976, day shift. We're making good progress on Section 12. Should hit quota by end of week," in the matter-of-fact tone of a routine status report. I pulled out my phone to verify the date, saw that it was November 7th, 2025, exactly 49 years later, and felt the first real spike of fear cut through my confusion. I moved back to the camp buildings, looking for any indication of current occupation, and found that the structures were in that impossible state between abandonment and active use. Weathered but functional, empty but recently occupied. Inside the mess hall, I found a table set for dinner with plates and cups that were both decades old and clean, and a calendar on the wall showing November 1976 with several dates marked for equipment maintenance. I found the accident report in the maintenance shed, filed in a metal cabinet that I had to force open with a pry bar from my gear. And the pages were yellowed with age, but the information was readable. On November 7th, 1976, the crew working this site, operated by Pacific Timber Corporation under a contract that was later revoked, experienced a catastrophic rigging failure during a skyline logging operation. The high-lead cable snapping under load and the resulting whiplash cutting through the landing area where most of the crew was positioned. 17 men died instantly or within minutes, their bodies so damaged that identification required dental records. And the site was immediately closed, the company dissolved in the subsequent investigations and lawsuits, and the Forest Service sealed the entire area, citing ongoing safety hazards. I walked back to the active cutting area with the report in my hands, and I understood with horrible clarity what I was witnessing. These men didn't know they were dead, were trapped in some kind of temporal loop that had them repeating the last day of their lives over and over, going through their routine with the professional focus that logging requires, heading toward an ending they couldn't remember because they'd been dead before they could process what killed them. I tried again to make contact, screaming at them to stop working, to listen to me, physically grabbing at their arms and tools. And they continued to move through their tasks with mechanical precision, occasionally looking puzzled when their hands passed through my body or when they reached for a tool that I was trying to hold. The sun was starting to descend, and I heard a foreman figure calling the crew back to camp. And they all moved together, toward the mess hall, laughing and joking about the day's work, comparing production numbers, planning for tomorrow's cutting areas. I followed them and watched as they filed into the mess hall, sitting at the table I'd seen earlier, and a cook who I hadn't noticed before began serving food from pots that appeared full when they should have been empty. They ate and talked, the conversation covering mundane topics like equipment repairs and weather forecasts and weekend plans that would never happen. And I noticed that several of them would occasionally pause mid-sentence, looking confused, touching their bodies like they'd felt something wrong before shaking it off and continuing their conversations. Around 7 that evening, I watched them prepare the rigging for the next morning's work, positioning the skyline cable and setting the chokers, and I saw the flaw in the cable setup that would kill them. Saw the overloaded block and the worn section of cable that was positioned exactly where stress would be highest. I tried to intervene, tried to physically remove the cable or adjust the rigging or do anything that might prevent what was about to happen. But my hands passed through the equipment without purchase, and the crew worked around me like I was fog. They finished their prep work, secured the site, and retired to the bunkhouses. And I sat outside in my truck, watching the camp through the darkness, seeing lights in the windows and smoke from the wood stove chimneys, hearing music from a radio playing country songs from the 70s. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just watched and waited. And at 6 in the morning, the crew emerged from the bunkhouses, looking rested and ready for work. No memory of yesterday or the day before that, or any of the thousands of days they'd repeated this same routine. They went through breakfast, morning equipment checks, safety briefings that covered procedures they'd violated countless times before. And then they moved to the landing area to begin the day's cutting. I was standing right at the landing when they started the yarder, that massive steam-powered winch that would pull logs uphill from the cutting area. And I could see the exact moment when everything would fail, could predict to the second when the overloaded cable would part. The cable snapped at 9:23, exactly when I knew it would. And the sound was the same crack I'd heard when my friend died. That sharp report followed by the whistle of steel cable whipping through air at lethal velocity. I watched 17 men die in 3 seconds, their bodies cut down by cable that moved too fast to dodge, screaming cut short by impacts that killed instantly. And then there was silence, complete silence, the forest holding its breath. The bodies lay in positions that were somehow wrong, like they weren't quite solid, and I could see through them to the disturbed ground beneath. And then they started to fade, becoming transparent, becoming nothing, disappearing entirely within seconds. The camp stood empty, and I thought for a moment that I'd broken the loop, that witnessing their deaths had somehow released them. But then I heard a chainsaw starting in the distance, heard men's voices calling coordinates to each other. And I walked back to the cutting area to find them all there again, alive and working. No memory of dying, starting their day fresh with the same enthusiasm and professional focus they'd had every morning for 49 years. I left then, drove back to the main highway, and filed my report about illegal logging activity, leaving out every detail that mattered, simply noting fresh cutting in a restricted area and recommending increased patrol. The Forest Service sent a team to investigate 2 weeks later and found nothing. No camp structures, no equipment, no evidence of recent logging activity except some old stumps from timber sales in the 70s. They filed my report as a clerical error, assumed I'd transposed coordinates or misread satellite imagery. And I didn't argue because how could I explain what I'd really seen? I've been back 3 times since then, driving those deteriorating logging roads to coordinates I have memorized, and sometimes the camp is there, visible and active, with smoke rising from chimneys and the sound of saws echoing through the trees. And sometimes there's nothing but old-growth forest and ravens calling. On the days when it's visible, I watch from a distance as those 17 men repeat their final day, working with the focus and pride that defined their generation of loggers, heading toward an ending they'll never remember and can never escape, trapped by the same industry that killed them in life, now holding them in death. My climbing partner, Jake, and I had summited Mount Rainier 8 times over the previous 3 years, always taking the standard disappointment cleaver route during the summer climbing window when conditions were safest and success rates highest. We were competent mountaineers, not professionals, but experienced enough to understand the mountain's dangers, the crevasses that could swallow you whole, the sudden weather changes that could reduce visibility to 0 in minutes, the altitude that affected judgment and created illusions your brain insisted were real. When we decided to attempt a winter ascent via the Gibraltar Ledges route in late January, we knew we were pushing our limits. But we'd trained specifically for winter conditions, invested in proper gear, and studied the route extensively through trip reports and beta from other climbers who'd successfully completed winter summits. Mount Rainier in winter is a completely different mountain than the summer version, with success rates dropping below 30% due to extreme cold, high winds, and avalanche danger that makes many routes completely impassable. We started our climb from Paradise at 3 in the morning, headlamps cutting through darkness as we followed the bootpack trail that hundreds of summer climbers had worn into the lower mountain, but which in January was buried under fresh snow that required us to break trail ourselves. The temperature was around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that my water bottles were starting to freeze despite insulation, and the wind was already picking up as we climbed through the darkness toward our planned high camp location at around 10,000 feet. We made good time initially, both of us moving efficiently with the rhythm that comes from extensive training, and we reached Anvil Rock by 6:30 as the sun was starting to illuminate the upper mountain in that incredible alpine glow that makes the suffering worthwhile. Jake was setting a steady pace, and I was following about 20 feet behind, both of us roped together for crevasse safety. When I noticed we were passing the same rock formation for the second time, a distinctive pillar of dark stone jutting through the snow that I'd photographed 10 minutes earlier. I called ahead to Jake, asked if he'd noticed us looping back, and he turned to look at me with confusion, saying we'd been climbing in a straight line following our GPS track. I pulled out my own GPS unit and checked our position, saw that according to the satellite data we were at 9,800 feet elevation, having gained steady altitude for the past 3 hours. But the distinctive rock pillar I'd photographed was at 9,600 feet according to my photo's metadata, and we definitely passed it twice now. Jake insisted I was experiencing altitude confusion, that in low light and uniform snow conditions, it's easy to think features look similar when they're actually different, a common phenomenon that mountaineers learn to recognize and compensate for. I accepted his explanation because it made sense, and because I wanted to believe my brain was just playing tricks rather than confronting the alternative, that something was fundamentally wrong with our location on the mountain. We continued climbing, and within another 30 minutes, I saw the rock pillar again. Same angle, same snow patterns around its base. And this time, I was certain because I deliberately scratched an X into the snow beside it with my ice axe during our second passing. The X was there, fresh and clear, which meant we'd somehow circled back to this exact location despite moving continuously uphill for 90 minutes. I stopped, forced Jake to stop, showed him the evidence, and watched his face change from skepticism to concern as he checked his own GPS and realized that our track showed us gaining elevation in a steady spiral pattern, covering ground but somehow remaining in the same location relative to that pillar. We studied the GPS tracks together, watching as the altitude reading climbed steadily, 9,800 to 9,900 to 10,000 feet. But the rock pillar beside us remained constant, unchanging, like we were climbing a treadmill that rose beneath our feet while leaving us in the same place. Jake suggested we descend, said something was wrong with our navigation equipment or our judgment, that attempting to continue in these conditions was asking for trouble. We turned around and started down, following our boot prints in the snow, and within 20 minutes we'd reached the rock pillar again, approaching it from below now, seeing our tracks and the X I'd scratched. But our GPS showed us descending from 10,000 feet to 9,600 feet. The mathematics didn't work. We'd climbed roughly 1,400 vertical feet in a spiral around this pillar without ever moving away from it. And we just descended 400 feet while arriving back at the same location we'd been trying to escape. Jake was breathing hard now, not from exertion, but from panic, that tight, controlled panic that experienced mountaineers learn to manage, but that still manifests in rapid breathing and jerky movements. We tried a different approach, deliberately heading 90 degrees away from our previous track, traversing across the slope rather than climbing or descending. And we moved for 45 minutes through increasingly difficult terrain, crossing sections that should have brought us to completely different parts of the mountain. We emerged from a section of broken ice blocks and were facing the rock pillar again, now approaching it from the east based on the sun position, but still arriving at the same impossible location. Jake sat down in the snow, pulled out his summit pack to inventory our supplies, and said we had food for 3 days. Fuel for maybe 5 if we rationed carefully, and enough warm clothing to survive temperatures down to about -10 if we could dig a snow cave and wait for rescue. I asked what we'd tell rescue teams about our location, and he just stared at me because we both knew the answer. We had no idea where we actually were, despite our GPS insisting we were on the standard route at 10,000 feet. That's when we saw the bodies, 3 of them, frozen in climbing positions about 50 yards upslope from the pillar. And I recognized one of them immediately because I'd read the incident report and seen his photo in climbing forums. His name was Marcus Chen. He disappeared on a solo winter ascent 4 years ago, and search teams had never found any trace of him, despite extensive aerial and ground searches. He was frozen in mid-stride, one crampon raised, ice axe planted, like he'd been flash frozen while still moving, and his face visible through his goggles showed an expression of confusion rather than fear or pain. The other 2 bodies were older, gear from the 80s or early 90s, and they were positioned at different points on the slope, but all within a 100-yard radius of the pillar. Jake moved closer to examine them, and I followed. And we discovered they all had identical GPS units attached to their packs, all still powered on, all showing altitude readings that continued to increment slowly, even though the climbers had obviously been dead for years. We spent 2 hours trying different strategies, following compass bearings, using the sun position to navigate, even trying to descend backward while watching our GPS to see if we could somehow reverse whatever spatial anomaly was trapping us. Every attempt brought us back to the pillar, sometimes approaching from different angles, sometimes appearing at different elevations relative to it, but always returning to the same impossible reference point. Our GPS altitude readings had climbed past 11,000 feet by this point, putting us theoretically at the upper reaches of the mountain near the summit crater. But we were still surrounded by the same terrain features, the same slope angle, the same weather conditions. Jake suggested we were experiencing severe altitude psychosis, a documented phenomenon where climbers develop paranoid delusions or hallucinations at extreme elevation. But we were barely above 10,000 feet true altitude, and we'd both been much higher without issues. I found the journal on my 4th circuit past the pillar, tucked into a gap between rocks where wind had prevented snow accumulation. A waterproof notebook with entries from at least 7 different climbers spanning decades. The earliest entry was from 1987, written by someone named Robert Talmadge, who described experiencing the exact same spatial loop, climbing continuously but never reaching the summit, GPS showing impossible altitude gains. He'd written methodically, documenting his observations, noting that he seemed to be trapped in a section of mountain that existed in its own localized space-time, still connected to the normal mountain, but following different rules. His final entry was dated 3 days after his first, a short line saying, "Food gone, starting to see others who tried to escape. We are all still climbing." Subsequent entries from other climbers told similar stories, some lasting days, others just hours before their final writings, all of them describing the same phenomenon, the continuous ascent that never reached anywhere. Jake read the journal over my shoulder, and his voice was shaking when he asked how we were supposed to get out if 7 other experienced climbers had failed. I pointed out that we'd only read 7 journal entries, but we'd seen 3 bodies, which meant at least 4 climbers had somehow escaped, had left the loop and returned to normal reality even if they'd never documented how they did it. We decided to try something none of the journal entries mentioned. Stop moving entirely, set up our tent, and wait to see if the loop had a temporal component, if staying stationary might allow normal space to reassert itself. We spent 6 hours in the tent, brewing water, eating, resting, and when we emerged, the pillar was still visible in the exact same position. But our GPS showed we'd climbed another 400 feet simply by remaining still. The storm hit around sunset, visibility dropping to zero as wind-driven snow created complete whiteout conditions. And in that moment of zero reference points, I felt something shift. Like the mountain itself was adjusting around us. When the wind died briefly 30 minutes later, the pillar was gone, replaced by normal slope with no distinctive features. And our GPS showed we were at 9,400 feet, lower than when we'd started encountering the loop. We didn't question it, didn't analyze, just turned downhill and moved as fast as safety allowed, descending through darkness with our headlamps illuminating only a few feet ahead. And we didn't stop until we'd reached Paradise parking lot 7 hours later. Our GPS tracks from that day show us climbing to over 13,000 feet before the data becomes corrupted, displaying impossible coordinates that place us simultaneously at multiple locations on the mountain. We reported the bodies we'd found, giving coordinates based on our initial encounter with the pillar before the loop began. And search teams investigated the area extensively but found nothing. No bodies, no distinctive rock formation matching our description, no evidence that anyone had been climbing in that section recently. The National Park Service classified our report as altitude-induced confusion, suggested we'd been on a completely different part of the mountain than we believed, and recommended we undergo additional training before attempting future winter ascents. Jake quit mountaineering entirely, sold all his gear, refuses to discuss what happened, and gets visibly agitated if anyone mentions Mount Rainier in his presence. I've attempted to return 3 times, trying to find that section of mountain where space folds back on itself, where climbers can ascend forever without reaching anywhere. But I've never encountered the spatial anomaly again. I still have the journal, though. I took it from the pillar, and I've added my own entry describing our experience. I check climbing forums regularly, looking for reports of other mountaineers who've encountered similar phenomena. And every few years I find a story that matches, someone describing continuous ascent without progress, GPS data that shows impossible elevation gains, bodies frozen in climbing positions that search teams never locate. Mount Rainier has claimed over 400 lives since systematic record-keeping began, and the mountain retains roughly half of those bodies in its glaciers and crevasses, some of them emerging decades later as the ice moves and melts, others remaining entombed forever in blue ice that never sees daylight. But there's a subset of disappearances that don't fit the standard patterns, climbers who vanish on clear days with good conditions, whose emergency beacons transmit for days from impossible locations, whose final GPS tracks show them climbing sections of mountain that don't exist on any map. I think they've found the loop, or the loop found them, and they're still up there somewhere, still climbing through whiteout conditions, still watching their GPS altitudes increment toward a summit they'll never reach. Trapped in a pocket of space where the mountain forgot to follow the normal rules of geometry and time. I built my career debunking paranormal claims, spending 15 years as a psychology professor at Western Washington University, while running a side consulting business investigating supposedly haunted locations and supernatural phenomena. My approach was methodical and scientific, using environmental monitoring equipment to identify mundane explanations for ghostly experiences, carbon monoxide detectors to explain hallucinations, and psychological profiling to understand why people want to believe in the supernatural. I'd investigated over 200 cases, everything from haunted houses to UFO sightings to alleged demonic possessions, and in every single instance, I'd found rational explanations rooted in psychology, environmental factors, or deliberate fraud. My professional reputation was built on skepticism, on being the person who could walk into any allegedly paranormal situation and emerged with data that proved the supernatural had nothing to do with what people were experiencing. That certainty ended during a 3-week investigation along the Mountain Loop Highway in Snohomish County, where I discovered that sometimes the legends are real, and sometimes dismissing them gets people killed. The Mountain Loop Highway is a scenic byway that runs through the Cascade Mountains northeast of Seattle, connecting Granite Falls to Darrington through some of the most remote wilderness in Washington state. It's also the site of an unusual concentration of disappearances and unsolved deaths spanning back to the 1800s. With at least 47 documented cases of people vanishing or being found dead under circumstances that investigations could never adequately explain. Most recently, a mother and daughter had been shot and killed on the Pinnacle Lake Trail in 2006. A case that remained unsolved for nearly 2 decades despite extensive investigation. And multiple hikers had disappeared from the Vesper Peak area, with search teams finding no trace despite optimal conditions. A local paranormal investigation group had contacted me, convinced that the area was experiencing supernatural activity, claiming they'd recorded electronic voice phenomena and documented temperature anomalies consistent with spiritual manifestations. They offered to pay my consulting fee if I'd spend 3 weeks investigating and either confirm or debunk their findings, confident that the evidence would convince even a skeptic like me. I arrived in mid-October during Washington's wettest season, when the area receives an average of 6 to 8 inches of rain in just that month alone, part of an annual rainfall total that can exceed 80 inches in the mountain regions. The rain here doesn't fall in dramatic storms. It's a persistent drizzle that continues for days or weeks, reducing visibility, soaking through every layer of clothing, and creating a constant low-grade misery that affects mood and cognition in measurable ways. I set up my base camp at a Forest Service cabin near the site where the mother and daughter had been killed, within hiking distance of several other locations associated with disappearances. My equipment included electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, audio recorders, environmental sensors tracking temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and air quality. Everything necessary to document and explain whatever phenomena the paranormal group had experienced. The first week was productive, in the ways I expected. I identified several natural explanations for reported anomalies, documented how wind patterns through the mountains created sounds that could be mistaken for voices, and showed how temperature inversions caused the exact thermal gradients that ghost hunters interpreted as paranormal cold spots. I was preparing my preliminary report, confident I'd debunk the supernatural claims within another week, when I experienced the first memory that wasn't mine. It happened during a particularly heavy rain on the 8th day. I was hiking back to the cabin after checking equipment at a remote site, soaked despite rain gear, when I suddenly knew with absolute certainty that I was being followed by someone who intended to kill me. The knowledge wasn't a feeling or an intuition. It was concrete information arriving in my consciousness the way memories do, complete with emotional context and sensory details. Except I'd never experienced this before. And the emotions attached to it were female, younger than me, terrified in a way that included concern for someone else, a daughter. I stopped walking, tried to analyze what had just happened, considered physiological explanations like temporal lobe epilepsy or transient ischemic attacks that could cause false memories or hallucinations. But the memory persisted and intensified. And I could feel myself on this trail years ago. Could remember the sound of footsteps behind me that had been following for the last quarter mile. Could feel the weight of a backpack I wasn't wearing in the presence of my daughter hiking beside me, who I've never had. Then the rain shifted slightly, wind changing direction, and the memory disappeared completely, leaving me standing alone on a muddy trail with my heart racing and my hands shaking. I documented the experience in my field notes, classified it as a possible stress-induced dissociative episode, and continued back to the cabin. But I was lying to myself, and I knew it because that memory had felt more real than my actual memories of that morning. Over the next 3 days, I experienced 17 more intrusive memories during rainfall, each one distinct, each one clearly belonging to different people who died in these woods. I remembered being lost and hypothermic, remembered the gradual shutdown of cognitive function as my core temperature dropped, remembered the strange, peaceful feeling that comes right before death from cold. I remembered drowning in the South Fork Stillaguamish River. The absolute panic of water in lungs, the desperate attempt to reach the surface just 3 feet above me. I remembered being shot, the impact and confusion, the fade to nothing. Each memory came with the rain, dissolved in the water that fell from the sky and soaked into my skin and hair. And each memory was accompanied by the terminal emotions of someone who died violently or accidentally in this watershed. I started systematically testing the phenomenon, setting up collection equipment during rainfall and immediately sealing samples in sterile containers. I discovered that fresh rainwater collected in areas associated with deaths or disappearances would trigger memory experiences when I exposed myself to it within minutes of collection. But the effect faded rapidly, usually within 20 minutes, as if the information carried in the water was unstable and degraded quickly at ambient temperature. I began researching water memory theory, the controversial hypothesis that water can retain information about substances or events it's been exposed to, a concept that mainstream science had thoroughly debunked decades ago. But what I was experiencing went far beyond the homeopathic claims of molecular memory. This was something that involved consciousness, emotion, and the recording of human experience in a medium that cycled through evaporation and precipitation over this specific geography. The area around Mountain Loop Highway forms a unique hydrological system, with watersheds that drain into the South Fork Stillaguamish and ultimately back to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration from the dense forest canopy. Washington's western slopes receive some of the highest rainfall totals in the continental United States, with certain locations recording over 100 inches annually, creating a continuous cycle where the same water molecules might fall as rain, be absorbed by soil or vegetation, and return to the atmosphere dozens of times per year within the same geographic area. If water could somehow record information, and if that information was tied to extreme emotional or traumatic events, then this system would create an accumulating memory archive, with each death adding its final moments to the perpetual rain that defined this region. By the end of the second week, I was deliberately exposing myself to rainfall at sites associated with known deaths, documenting the memories I received and cross-referencing them with historical records and case files from Snohomish County Sheriff's Department. The accuracy was disturbing. I was experiencing details that had never been made public, information that could only come from the victims themselves, specifics about their final moments that investigation reports confirmed, but that I had no way of accessing through normal channels. I hiked to the Pinnacle Lake Trail during a heavy rain and experienced Mary Cooper's final minutes, felt the confusion when she realized someone was pointing a gun at her, felt her desperate need to protect her daughter, felt the impact and the fade. I stood at the South Fork crossing and remembered drowning from the perspective of multiple victims spanning decades, each one adding their panic to the accumulated experience carried in the water. The worst part was realizing I wasn't just receiving memories. Prolonged exposure was causing my own memories to destabilize and fade. By the third week, I was having trouble remembering my life before coming to this area. My childhood was becoming vague. My professional history was slipping away, and the memories of the dead were becoming more vivid and persistent than my own experiences. I would find myself starting to think in perspectives that weren't mine, using phrases and emotional responses that belonged to people who died here. And I understood with growing horror that the rain didn't just carry memories. It exchanged them, taking from the living to feed the accumulated consciousness distributed through the watershed. I attempted to leave on day 19, packed my equipment, and started driving out. But I couldn't remember where I was going or why leaving felt important. I sat in my truck at the Granite Falls Junction, trying to recall my name, my profession, anything about who I'd been before I came to these woods. And all I could access were fragments, pieces of identity dissolving like information in water. The rain was constant now, the wettest October on record for Snohomish County. And I could feel new memories arriving with every drop that hit my skin. People who died decades ago, people who died recently, all of them sharing their final moments, all of them taking something in return. I returned to the cabin and spent 3 days reviewing my field notes, reading my own handwriting describing a life and career that felt like it belonged to someone else. The psychological professor who'd arrived skeptical and confident had been methodically erased by accumulated exposure to traumatic memories carried in rainwater. My identity dissolving into the collective consciousness of everyone who died in this hydrological system. I made the decision to document everything while I still retained enough of myself to write coherently. Creating a detailed account of the phenomenon, the mechanism I believed was operating, and a warning that investigation of this area during rainfall represented a genuine psychological hazard. The Paranormal Investigation Group found me on day 23, still in the cabin, sitting in the rain outside the door because being in the rain felt more natural than seeking shelter. They said I'd missed 3 scheduled check-ins and they'd driven up to make sure I was okay. I handed them my documentation, my field notes and audio recordings and detailed analysis, and told them they were right about this place, that it was genuinely paranormal, that the dead were present in a way that science couldn't yet explain, but that I'd measured and confirmed. They were excited, vindicated, asking questions about my findings and whether I'd be willing to co-author a paper about the discovery. I told them I couldn't write the paper because I couldn't remember my credentials anymore. Couldn't remember the methodology or the academic framework, could only remember dying here in dozens of different ways over decades of accumulated deaths. They drove me to a hospital in Everett where doctors ran neurological tests that found nothing physically wrong, no tumors or lesions or chemical imbalances, just a patient who couldn't reliably access personal memories, but who could describe in vivid detail the final moments of people he'd never met. The psychiatric evaluation concluded I'd experienced a severe dissociative episode, brought on by isolation and exposure to traumatic location histories, recommended cognitive behavioral therapy and medication, and noted that my prognosis was poor given the extent of identity disruption. I was released after 2 weeks when insurance coverage ended, and I immediately drove back to Mountain Loop Highway because the rain there felt like home, in a way that my apartment in Bellingham didn't. I live in the area now, in a small rental in Granite Falls, and I work as an unofficial consultant for families of missing persons, telling them what I see in the rain about their loved ones' final moments. Sometimes the information helps bring closure. Sometimes it just adds to the horror. But I document everything because that's what the part of me that was a professor would have wanted. I can't leave, not permanently, because my identity is bound to this place now, distributed through the watershed like information in solution. And when I'm away from the rain for more than a few days, I start to fade, becoming vague and insubstantial like I'm being erased. The dead here are still dying, new disappearances every few years adding their memories to the cycle. And I experience all of them, receiving their final moments with each rainfall, adding their trauma to my accumulated consciousness while losing more of whoever I used to be. Washington State is projected to experience increasing extreme precipitation events as climate change progresses, with heavy rain events in western Washington expected to increase in intensity by 22% by end of century. More rain means more efficient transfer of information, more rapid erosion of identity for anyone exposed, and more people experiencing intrusive memories without understanding what's happening to them. I've tried warning hikers, posting in forums about avoiding the Mountain Loop Highway area during rainfall, but I sound like the paranormal investigators I used to debunk, making claims that seem absurd to anyone who hasn't experienced the phenomenon. My documentation sits in storage, too detailed and too strange for any journal to publish, too specific in its accuracy for anyone to completely dismiss, evidence that sometimes the supernatural is just science. We haven't figured out how to measure properly yet. I still have enough of my original identity to know what I've lost, to understand that the skeptic who came here to debunk ghost stories was destroyed by something far more insidious than ghosts, by a natural phenomenon that uses the hydrological cycle to preserve and transmit consciousness across decades. When people ask what I am now, I tell them I'm a memory of a psychologist, diluted and distributed through rainfall, carrying information about hundreds of deaths while barely remembering my own life. And when it rains, which in western Washington is almost constant from October through May, I stand outside and let the water soak into me, receiving new memories while forgetting my name, adding to the collective consciousness that exists nowhere and everywhere in these woods, waiting for the next person who thinks they can investigate the unexplained without becoming part of it themselves. I've been a wildlife photographer for 23 years, specializing in nocturnal species documentation for conservation organizations and scientific journals across the Pacific Northwest. My work involves weeks-long solo camping trips in remote forest locations, setting up camera trap networks to capture images of elusive species that are rarely photographed in their natural behaviors. Everything from Pacific fishers to northern spotted owls to the occasional black bear passing through established territories. I'm methodical about site selection, choosing locations based on habitat characteristics, prey availability, and historical sighting data. And I've developed protocols that maximize my chances of documenting rare behaviors while minimizing my impact on the ecosystem I'm observing. My credentials include over 200 published photographs, contributions to 3 major conservation studies, and a reputation for being able to work in challenging conditions that would discourage less experienced photographers. That reputation is about to be destroyed because I spent 4 weeks documenting something in the Cascade foothills that I cannot explain, cannot publish, and cannot report without sounding like I've lost my mind. The assignment was straightforward. Document great gray owls in a section of private timberland about 40 miles east of Everett, where the logging company had agreed to set aside old-growth corridors as part of a habitat conservation plan. The forest was spectacular. Western red cedars and Douglas firs reaching nearly 200 feet in height, their canopy so dense that ground-level light conditions were perpetually dim even at midday, creating the cathedral-like atmosphere that defines old-growth ecosystems in western Washington. I set up base camp in a small clearing surrounded by these massive trees, established my camera trap grid covering roughly 3 square miles, and settled into the patient observation routine that this work requires. The first week was productive in all the expected ways. I captured excellent footage of 2 different owl pairs, documented a family of flying squirrels using a cavity nest in a dead snag, and recorded normal predator-prey interactions in the canopy between weasels and various small mammals. On the 8th night, I noticed something unusual in my camera trap data when I collected the memory cards for review. Camera 12 positioned at the northern edge of my grid about 30 feet up in a massive cedar, had recorded 217 images over a 6-hour period, all of them showing nothing. Just empty forest with slight variations in shadow and wind movement. This kind of false triggering happens occasionally with motion-activated cameras, usually caused by moving vegetation or environmental temperature changes, confusing the sensors. But 200 images in 6 hours suggested either equipment malfunction or something moving through the frame in a way the camera couldn't properly capture. I reviewed each image carefully, looking for the subtle details that might indicate what triggered the sensor. And in image 143 I saw it. A section of bark that was slightly wrong. Texture that didn't quite match the surrounding tree trunk. I spent 3 hours analyzing that single image, comparing it to photos from the same camera taken days earlier. And I realized that what I'd initially dismissed as a shadow or irregularity in the bark was actually something pressed against the tree trunk, something large enough that its bulk was visible as a distortion in the expected patterns of cedar bark. I went back to camera 12's location the next day, climbing up to inspect the mounting point and the tree it was aimed at. And I found pressure marks on the bark of the cedar directly opposite the camera. Fresh damage where something heavy had gripped the trunk hard enough to compress the outer layers of wood. The marks were roughly hand-shaped, or at least shaped like a hand, if hands were twice the normal size and strong enough to dent hardwood. I photographed the damage, measured the impressions, collected bark samples, and tried to develop a rational explanation that didn't involve something massive and unknown living in the forest canopy. Over the next week, I documented similar incidents across my entire camera grid, with 11 of my 15 cameras capturing sequences of images showing nothing while simultaneously recording movement that triggered hundreds of exposures. I started reviewing the footage more carefully, not looking for clear images of wildlife, but searching for the subtle displacement clues that indicated something was actively avoiding capture, while remaining close enough to trigger the motion sensors. In one sequence from camera 7, I could track movement through 17 consecutive images by watching how branches shifted position between frames, something large moving through the canopy from one tree to another, traveling at a height of roughly 40 feet above ground and leaving no visible trace in the actual photographs. The physics didn't work for any known Pacific Northwest species. Black bears occasionally climb, but they're not arboreal enough to move through the canopy with that kind of speed and control. And nothing else in this ecosystem had the body mass to bend branches that significantly. I should have ended the project then, packed my equipment and reported the site as unsuitable for the intended owl study. But professional curiosity and something approaching obsession kept me there. I modified my camera trap setup, adding thermal imaging capability to 3 of the cameras and adjusting trigger sensitivity to capture even minimal movement. I also started staying awake through the night, watching my camp perimeter with night vision equipment, trying to directly observe whatever was moving through the canopy around me. The first direct sighting happened on night 17, around 2 in the morning, when I heard branch movement directly above my tent. The distinctive creak of wood flexing under significant weight. I emerged from the tent slowly, night vision monocular already at my eye, and scanned the canopy overhead, seeing nothing initially, just the complex architecture of branches and needles that characterizes old-growth forest. Then I saw it move, or rather, I saw the space between branches shift as something massive relocated from one position to another, about 70 feet above me, moving with deliberate care that suggested awareness of my presence below. Through the night vision, which amplifies available light but doesn't provide thermal data, I could only see displacement, branches moving in sequence as weight transferred from one to another. Occasional glimpses of bulk that my brain refused to process into coherent form. The movement pattern suggested bipedal locomotion through the canopy, using arm strength to move between trees while maintaining upright posture. Behavior that resembled primate arboreal movement, but at a scale that exceeded any known North American species by a factor of 3 or 4. I watched for nearly 20 minutes as it circled my camp, staying in the canopy, never descending lower than 50 feet. And I had the distinct impression that I was being evaluated, studied with the same careful observation I'd been applying to the forest's wildlife. I collected my thermal cameras the next morning and reviewed the footage. And what I found confirmed my worst suspicions while raising questions I had no framework for answering. The thermal imaging had captured clear heat signatures of something in the canopy. A large bipedal form showing temperature distribution consistent with active musculature and core body heat in the range of 95 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit. The creature, and I had to start calling it that because no other term fit, was roughly 8 feet tall based on comparative measurements against known tree dimensions, with proportions that suggested massive upper body strength and limb length that exceeded human norms by at least 40%. It moved through the canopy with practiced efficiency, using established routes between trees, demonstrating familiarity with this specific forest section that indicated long-term residence. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the physical evidence, but the behavioral patterns I documented over the following week. The creature was watching me, specifically me, adjusting its observation position based on my movements through camp, maintaining line of sight even when I relocated to different areas within my study site. It was learning my patterns, noting when I collected camera cards, when I prepared meals, when I slept, building a comprehensive understanding of my routine that demonstrated intelligence far beyond simple animal curiosity. I found evidence of its presence in increasingly bold placements. Tree bark stripped at eye level outside my tent, arrangements of pine cones in geometric patterns that couldn't be natural. And on 2 occasions, my equipment moved during the night to different locations within camp, despite being secured. I started documenting everything with obsessive detail, maintaining field notes that read more like police surveillance logs than wildlife observation records, tracking the creature's appearances, estimating its size and weight based on the structural deflection of branches, and noting behavioral patterns that suggested complex cognition. On night 23, it descended to ground level for the first time, and I watched through my night vision as something massive moved through the understory about 30 yards from my tent. Bipedal locomotion with a rolling gait that accommodated its bulk, pausing occasionally to examine my camera trap placements. It approached camera 4, which I'd mounted on a tree at 6 feet height, and I watched as it studied the device, reaching out with a hand that filled my entire field of view, touching the camera housing with surprising gentleness. Then it looked directly at my tent, or at least turned its head in that direction. And even through the green-tinted night vision, I could see eyes reflecting the ambient light, eyes shine from something that shouldn't exist. I left the next morning, not fleeing exactly, but executing a strategic withdrawal while I still had enough cognitive function to recognize that I was no longer the observer in this situation. I'd become the observed. I packed my essential equipment, left the camera traps in place because returning for them felt dangerous in a primal way I couldn't articulate, and hiked the 6 miles out to where I'd parked my vehicle. When I reached my truck, I found 4 parallel scratches in the driver's side door, deep grooves that had removed paint and dented metal, placed at a height that suggested something had stood beside the vehicle and marked it deliberately. The scratches hadn't been there when I'd hiked in 3 weeks earlier, which meant this creature had traveled at least 6 miles from my camp location to find my vehicle and leave a message that I interpreted as a warning or possibly a claim of territory. I reported the site to the logging company as unsuitable for the owl study, citing unexpected environmental conditions without providing specifics. And I've never returned to that section of forest. The thermal footage and photographs I captured are stored in an encrypted drive that I've shown to exactly 3 people, all of them experienced wildlife biologists. And all 3 have suggested I either experienced equipment malfunction or faked the images for attention. The Sasquatch research community would embrace my evidence enthusiastically. But I've spent my career building credibility through rigorous scientific methodology, and I can't afford association with cryptozoology, legitimate or not. The academic community would destroy my reputation if I published claims about an unknown 8-foot bipedal creature living in Washington's old-growth canopy. And I have no genetic samples, no clear photographs. Nothing that meets the evidentiary standards for species documentation. What I do have is the knowledge that something is living in those forests, something that has adapted to arboreal life in ways that allow it to avoid human detection despite our camera-trap networks and satellite imagery and confident assumption that we've cataloged all significant fauna in our own backyard. The Pacific Northwest's old-growth forests represent some of the most biomass-dense ecosystems on Earth, with canopy structures that remained largely unexplored because they're difficult to access and because we assume we know what's up there. These forests have canopy heights reaching 200 feet with complex 3-dimensional architecture that provides habitat and movement corridors completely separate from ground-level ecosystems. And we've barely begun to document the species interactions that occur in that elevated environment. I've reviewed historical reports from the region, going back to indigenous accounts and early logging-era stories. And there's a consistent thread of sightings and encounters describing massive humanoid creatures associated with old-growth forests, particularly in areas with extensive canopy development. Modern Sasquatch research focuses almost exclusively on ground-level evidence, footprints and ground nests, and terrestrial movement patterns. But what if we've been looking in the wrong place? What if these creatures are primarily arboreal, coming to ground only occasionally, spending most of their time in the canopy where their size and strength allow them to move between trees that are spaced too far apart for any other large mammal to navigate? That would explain the lack of consistent ground evidence, the difficulty in capturing clear photographs, and the persistent reports of tree knocking and branches being manipulated high above observer heads. I still work as a wildlife photographer, but I've changed my site selection criteria, avoiding old-growth forests with extensive canopy development, focusing instead on younger stands and more open habitats where visibility extends beyond 30 feet. I've also developed an acute sensitivity to being watched, that primal awareness that prey species have when predators are near. And I've experienced it 3 times since leaving that Cascade Foothills site. Always in old-growth forests, always with the sense that something large is observing from the canopy above. My colleagues have noticed the change in my work patterns, and several have asked why I've abandoned the dramatic old-growth settings that defined my early career. And I tell them I'm exploring new ecosystems and diversifying my portfolio, which is technically true even if it avoids the real reason. The camera traps I abandoned at that site are probably still there. Batteries long dead, memory cards full of images I'll never retrieve. Sometimes I wonder what they captured in the weeks and months after I left, whether the creature continued to investigate them, or whether it recognized my permanent absence and returned to whatever behavioral patterns it maintained before I arrived to disrupt its territory. I wonder if it's still there, moving through that cathedral forest at night, watching new visitors with the same careful intelligence it directed at me, learning their patterns while remaining invisible in plain sight. And I wonder how many other photographers and hikers and researchers have had similar experiences but stayed quiet, because speaking up means professional suicide, means being dismissed as attention-seeking or delusional, means losing the credibility we've spent careers building. The Pacific Northwest's old-growth forests cover millions of acres across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, with vast sections that receive minimal human visitation and even less systematic study. And if something intelligent wanted to remain hidden while observing us, that canopy would provide perfect cover. I've been a professional speleologist for 11 years, specializing in volcanic cave systems across the Pacific Northwest, documenting lava tube formations for geological surveys, and occasionally consulting on cave conservation projects. My work has taken me into hundreds of caves, from well-known tourist destinations like Ape Cave at Mount St. Helens to newly discovered systems that I'm the first human to explore. And I've developed the kind of comfort with underground environments that most people find incomprehensible. Being 200 feet underground in complete darkness with millions of tons of rock overhead doesn't trigger claustrophobia for me. It triggers fascination, that pure scientific curiosity about what formed these spaces and what might be living in them. I thought I'd seen everything that Washington's volcanic geology could produce, every variation of lava tube architecture and cave ecosystem, until I discovered a chamber system beneath Mount St. Helens that shouldn't exist, according to every geological model I've studied. The discovery happened during a university-funded survey, mapping undocumented lava tubes in the southern flank flow fields, the same ancient lava flows that created Ape Cave nearly 2,000 years ago. I was working solo, which is generally discouraged, but sometimes necessary, when research budgets are tight and experienced cavers are scarce. Following a potential tube extension that ground-penetrating radar suggested might connect to unexplored chambers. The entrance was a collapsed section about 4 miles from the nearest trail, hidden under decades of forest debris and requiring careful excavation to access safely. I spent 2 days clearing the entrance and establishing safety protocols before making my first descent, rappelling down a 30-foot vertical shaft into what I expected to be a standard lava tube continuation. The initial section was unremarkable. Textbook lava tube morphology with the characteristic smooth walls created by flowing basalt. The expected 42-degree temperature that defines these environments year-round, and the complete darkness that requires artificial lighting for any exploration. I moved through the passage for roughly 300 yards, documenting formations and taking environmental measurements. When I noticed the temperature increasing, subtle at first, but definitely rising as I progressed deeper. Within another 100 yards, the temperature had climbed from 42 degrees to nearly 60 degrees. Which was unusual enough to warrant immediate documentation because lava tubes are supposed to maintain constant temperatures reflecting annual surface averages. The passage was also widening significantly, transitioning from the typical 8-foot diameter tube to a chamber that my headlamp couldn't fully illuminate. I emerged into a cavern that defied immediate comprehension, my light revealing a space so vast that the far walls were invisible, with ceiling height extending beyond my lamp's range. But what stopped me completely was the light source that wasn't my headlamp. A faint greenish-blue glow emanating from the chamber floor and walls, bioluminescence on a scale I'd never encountered in any cave system. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was looking at vegetation, actual living plants covering the chamber floor, stems and leaves and structures that resembled trees but glowed with internal light, creating an eerie twilight atmosphere that allowed me to see without artificial illumination. The scientific impossibility of what I was observing didn't immediately register because my brain was too busy trying to process the visual input, trying to categorize what I was seeing into known biological frameworks. I spent 20 minutes at the chamber entrance just observing, documenting with video and still photography, checking my equipment to confirm I wasn't experiencing equipment malfunction or hallucination from bad air. The vegetation was definitely real, covering an area I estimated at several acres, with the tallest structures reaching perhaps 15 feet in height. The bioluminescence appeared to come from the plant tissues themselves rather than from symbiotic fungi or bacteria, though I couldn't confirm that without tissue samples. The entire ecosystem was operating in complete isolation from surface conditions. No sunlight penetration, no obvious connection to surface water sources, existing in a sealed chamber that geological formation dates suggested had been closed for nearly 2,000 years. I moved into the chamber slowly, testing the ground stability, and discovered the floor was covered in a thick layer of organic material that compressed under my weight like mulch or composted vegetation. The air quality was breathable, actually richer in oxygen than the entrance passage, suggesting active photosynthesis despite the absence of sunlight. I collected air samples, documented carbon dioxide levels, and confirmed that the atmospheric composition was consistent with a functioning plant ecosystem, which should have been impossible without an external energy source. The bioluminescent glow wasn't bright enough for traditional photosynthesis, maybe equivalent to moonlight at best. But somehow these plants were thriving, growing, and presumably reproducing in conditions that violated basic biological principles. I spent 3 hours exploring the perimeter of the chamber, mapping its dimensions and documenting the diversity of life forms present. There were at least 30 distinct plant species based on morphological differences, ranging from low ground cover to the tree-like structures, all of them exhibiting bioluminescence in varying intensities. I also found insects, small arthropods moving through the vegetation, and what appeared to be a species of cave cricket that had evolved to feed on the glowing plants. The ecosystem was complete and self-sustaining, a functioning biosphere that had been evolving in isolation for potentially thousands of years. The implications were staggering. This represented an entirely unknown form of photosynthesis, or an alternative energy pathway that biology hadn't documented, and I was the only person who knew it existed. That's when I noticed the vegetation was moving, not swaying like surface plants responding to wind, but deliberately repositioning, stems bending toward me, leaves orienting to track my movement through the chamber. I initially dismissed this as standard phototropic response, plants orienting toward my headlamp. But when I turned off my light, the movement continued, the glowing vegetation adjusting position to maintain orientation toward me in the darkness. I stood completely still for 5 minutes, barely breathing, and watched as the nearest tree-like structure slowly extended a branch in my direction, the limb growing visibly, adding length at a rate that should have taken days or weeks, but was happening in real time. I backed away, and the vegetation followed. Not aggressively, but with clear, intentional movement. Multiple plant structures coordinating their growth patterns to maintain proximity to me. I realized I was experiencing predatory behavior, or at least investigatory behavior, from an ecosystem that had never encountered a large mobile organism before and was responding with what might be hunger or curiosity, or both. The ground beneath my feet shifted, and I looked down to see root structures emerging from the organic mulch, thin tendrils that wrapped around my boots with surprising strength. I pulled free and moved faster toward the chamber entrance, and the entire forest responded, the bioluminescence intensifying, illuminating the chamber to near daylight levels. And I could see that what I'd interpreted as a static garden was actually a coordinated organism. Individual plants connected through an underground network, functioning as a single entity. The roots were spreading now, creating a barrier between me and the exit passage, growing with that impossible speed, blocking my retreat route with walls of vegetation that hadn't been there seconds earlier. I ran then, cutting through the undergrowth with my rock hammer, feeling the plants grabbing at me, their touch leaving burning sensations on exposed skin, like chemical irritation or maybe injection of digestive enzymes. I could hear sounds now, not quite vocalizations, but vibrations traveling through the vegetation, communication between the different plant structures, coordinating their response to my escape attempt. I reached the exit passage and scrambled through just as the opening filled with questing roots that pursued me into the lava tube, extending perhaps 30 feet before stopping, unable or unwilling to leave the main chamber environment. I climbed out of the cave system as fast as safety allowed, emerging into afternoon sunlight that felt surreal after the underground bioluminescence. And I sat at the entrance for an hour trying to process what I'd just experienced. Every scientific instinct insisted I needed to return with proper equipment, collect samples, document this discovery thoroughly. But every survival instinct warned me that going back into that chamber meant potentially becoming food for an ecosystem that had evolved predatory behaviors in total isolation from surface life. I reviewed my video footage and photographs that night, confirming that what I'd experienced was documented and real, not hallucination or equipment error. And then I faced the decision that's been consuming me for the last 3 months. The discovery of a completely novel photosynthetic pathway operating through bioluminescence would revolutionize biology. The documentation of a functioning underground ecosystem with this level of complexity would rewrite textbooks, and the career implications of being the person who found it would be transformative. But I'd also discovered what amounts to a predatory intelligence distributed through a plant network, something that actively responds to intruders and attempts to prevent them from leaving. And I have chemical burns on my arms and legs that took weeks to heal. Burns that tissue analysis showed contained enzymes consistent with digestive processes. The ethical considerations are complex. Do I have an obligation to report this ecosystem so it can be studied and protected? Or do I have an obligation to seal that entrance and prevent anyone else from encountering something that demonstrated clear predatory intent? I've contacted 3 colleagues with cave ecology expertise, describing my findings in general terms without providing location specifics. And all 3 have expressed skepticism ranging from polite doubt to open dismissal. Bioluminescent ecosystems exist in caves. They're well documented, but they're always small scale, limited to bacterial colonies or fungal networks, never approaching the complexity or scale of what I found. The idea of tree-sized plants operating on bioluminescent energy seems implausible enough that my colleagues assume I'm either misinterpreting what I saw or fabricating data. And I can't produce tissue samples to prove my claims because I barely escaped with my life, and wasn't about to stop and collect specimens while being actively hunted. Mount St. Helens has hundreds of undocumented lava tubes and cave systems, with new discoveries happening regularly as cavers explore the extensive flow fields that radiate from the volcano. The volcanic geology creates ideal conditions for sealed chambers, spaces that close off during the cooling process and remain isolated for thousands of years. Perfect environments for evolution to take unusual paths. If one chamber developed this kind of ecosystem, there could be others. Sealed chambers scattered throughout the mountain's underground network, where life has adapted to conditions we've never studied. The subterranean environment covers vast areas globally, representing one of the least explored ecosystems on Earth, with new species discovered regularly. And we've barely scratched the surface of understanding what might be living in those dark spaces. I've been back to the entrance site twice, both times intending to return for proper documentation. And both times I've sat at the opening listening to sounds emerging from below, not quite mechanical, but not quite organic either. Rhythmic patterns that might be roots moving, or might be the forest breathing, or might be something I don't have vocabulary to describe. I've sealed the entrance temporarily with the excuse that I'm waiting for proper permits and safety equipment. But truthfully, I'm terrified of what I found down there, and uncertain whether science's need to know outweighs the danger of exposing other researchers to a predatory ecosystem. The video footage plays on loop in my head. That moment when the entire forest lit up and I realized I was inside something alive. Something that had been waiting in darkness for 2,000 years for organic matter to stumble into its domain. Subterranean ecosystems are among the most fragile environments on Earth. Easily damaged by human intrusion and slow to recover from disturbance because of the limited energy inputs and slow metabolic processes that characterize life in darkness. What I found isn't fragile, though. It's vigorous and adaptive, and demonstrably capable of rapid response to threats or opportunities. And I think sealing it away might be the responsible choice, even if it means abandoning the most significant biological discovery of my career. I've documented everything, created detailed maps, preserved all my footage and field notes, and locked them in storage with instructions to release them to the scientific community only if I die or disappear. My insurance policy against the forest somehow reaching the surface. I still work as a speleologist, but I've stopped exploring new caves, limiting myself to well-documented systems with established safety records. And my colleagues have noticed the change in my behavior. They ask why I'm avoiding the interesting work, why I turned down a grant to continue mapping Mount St. Helens tubes, and I tell them I'm focusing on other projects or that I'm dealing with personal issues. Anything except the truth that I found something under that mountain that changed how I think about caves and ecosystems, and whether some discoveries should remain buried. The entrance I sealed is showing signs of disturbance. The covering I placed has been displaced from below, as if something is testing the barrier. And I've started checking the site weekly to ensure nothing has emerged. I don't know if the forest is trying to escape or if it's simply growing, expanding its territory now that it's been awakened by my intrusion. But I watch that sealed entrance with the knowledge that beneath my feet there's an entire world glowing in the darkness, waiting patiently for its next meal to descend into chambers that should have remained undiscovered forever. I've changed how I teach my courses at Wenatchee Valley College since returning from that trail, no longer focusing exclusively on archival research and written documentation, but incorporating the concept that landscapes themselves can serve as historical records. My colleagues think I've become too focused on oral histories and anecdotal accounts, that I'm straying from rigorous academic methodology. But I've documented 3 additional massacre sites using the same approach. Following leads to locations where the land forces visitors to witness what happened there. Each site operates slightly differently, some showing only fragments of events, others providing complete, immersive experiences that last for days. But all of them serve the same function of preventing historical erasure. The psychological cost of this work is significant in ways I didn't anticipate when I started. I carry the deaths of over 100 people now, their final moments integrated into my memory, as if I'd personally witnessed each one. And the accumulated trauma affects my sleep, my relationships, my ability to function in normal social situations. I've started seeing a therapist who specializes in secondary traumatic stress, the kind that affects first responders and trauma counselors who are exposed to others' suffering. And she suggested I stop visiting these sites, that the work is destroying my mental health. But I can't stop because these people have been waiting for over 1.5 centuries for someone to acknowledge what happened to them, for someone with the platform and credentials to force their stories into the historical record where they belong. The Washington State Historical Society is now investigating 12 sites I've documented, conducting archaeological surveys to verify the physical evidence that supports the visions I've experienced. They've found bullets, military equipment, and in 3 cases, unmarked graves containing remains that show evidence of violent death during the correct time period. The correlation between what I've experienced and what archaeology confirms is too strong to dismiss as coincidence or fabrication, which is forcing uncomfortable conversations in academic circles about the nature of historical memory and how trauma might persist in physical locations. I've been contacted by tribal historians from across the Pacific Northwest, all of them sharing accounts of places where similar phenomena occur, sites sacred to their communities, not just for spiritual reasons, but because the land actively maintains memory of what happened there. The indigenous perspective on this is fundamentally different from Western academic frameworks. They've always known that land holds memory. The places where great suffering occurred remain spiritually active. And they're not surprised that outsiders are finally beginning to experience what their communities have understood for generations. The Colville elders I've worked with tell me that the massacre site chose me specifically because I had the combination of historical knowledge, academic credibility, and willingness to endure the trauma necessary to document what happened there. The trail itself has become a place of pilgrimage for descendants of massacre victims, tribal members traveling from across Washington and Idaho to visit the site where their ancestors died. The Forest Service has established a small parking area and marked the trailhead, though they haven't erected any interpretive signs explaining the site's significance, because the historical documentation is still being processed through official channels. I've guided 17 families to the clearing over the past 8 months, and while they don't experience the forced visions that I did, many report feeling the presence of their ancestors, sensing welcome and peace in a place that once held only violence and death. The research community working on historical trauma and landscape memory has grown significantly, with anthropologists, psychologists, and historians collaborating to understand how traumatic events might create lasting effects in physical locations. The prevailing theories suggest that extreme emotional states during mass death events might interact with environmental factors in ways we don't yet understand, creating something like a recording that can be accessed under specific conditions. Other researchers are exploring quantum theories about consciousness and memory, suggesting that information might be stored in ways that transcend individual brains and become embedded in the physical structures of places where significant events occurred. I've started training other researchers who want to document erased massacre sites, teaching them how to prepare psychologically for the kind of traumatic exposure this work requires. The process involves building mental resilience, establishing support systems, and developing protocols for managing the secondary trauma that comes from experiencing others' deaths. Not everyone can do this work. Some people visit these sites and experience nothing, while others are overwhelmed to the point of psychological breakdown. There seems to be a selection process, with the land choosing who receives the visions based on factors we don't fully understand, but which appear related to the person's ability to process the information and use it constructively. The Okanogan Wenatchee site continues to affect me in ways that extend beyond the initial experience. I dream about the people who died there. Not nightmares exactly, but visitation dreams where they show me additional details about their lives, where they express gratitude that someone finally knows their names and how they died. I've verified several of these dream-provided details through archival research, finding references to specific individuals in obscure documents that I had no conscious knowledge of, suggesting that the information transfer is ongoing and extends beyond the physical trail location. My relationship with time has become complicated since spending those 4 days on the massacre trail. Sometimes I experience moments where I'm uncertain which century I'm in, where the 1858 massacre feels more immediate and real than my current life in 2025. The therapist says this is a form of dissociation, a defense mechanism against overwhelming trauma, but it feels more like I exist partially in multiple time periods simultaneously, connected to past events through the memories I carry. The victims whose deaths I witnessed aren't abstract historical figures to me anymore. They're people I know intimately, whose fear and pain I've experienced, and their suffering demands acknowledgement in ways that transcend academic documentation. The Forest Service has asked me to consult on developing appropriate memorialization for the site, working with tribal representatives to design something that honors the victims while educating visitors about the historical context of indigenous displacement in Washington. The challenge is conveying the reality of what happened without sanitizing it, acknowledging the deliberate violence while respecting the descendants who visit to connect with their ancestors. We're proposing a memorial that includes the 41 names I documented, brief biographical information about each person, and historical context explaining the policies that led to their deaths. The wider implications of this work extend beyond individual massacre sites to questions about how we understand history and memory. If traumatic events can imprint on landscapes in ways that persist for generations, then there are likely thousands of similar sites across North America. Places where the land holds memories of violence that official records have erased. Indigenous communities have maintained oral histories of these locations, but Western academic culture has consistently dismissed such accounts as legend or metaphor rather than recognizing them as accurate historical documentation. The phenomenon I experienced forces a fundamental reconsideration of what constitutes valid historical evidence and how we access information about the past. I've been invited to present my findings at the American Historical Association's annual conference, and I'm uncertain how to frame the presentation in ways that academic audiences will accept. The empirical evidence is strong, the archaeological findings confirm the vision's accuracy, and the correlation between my documented experiences and tribal oral histories is undeniable. But the mechanism by which I received this information challenges fundamental assumptions about how memory works and how we can know about past events. I'm preparing a presentation that focuses on the verifiable results while carefully describing the experiential process, hoping that the academic community will prioritize the accuracy of the information over skepticism about its source. The students in my Pacific Northwest history courses are fascinated by this research, particularly Indigenous students who recognize the phenomena I'm describing from their own cultural contexts. They understand instinctively what I've spent years trying to articulate in academic language: that the land remembers, that places hold the suffering of those who died there, and that respecting and acknowledging this memory is essential for healing historical trauma. Several of them have begun their own projects documenting family histories of displacement and violence. And I'm watching a new generation of historians emerge who are comfortable bridging Indigenous and Western approaches to understanding the past. The massacre trail in the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest remains accessible to hikers, and I receive regular reports from people who've experienced various levels of vision or presence while walking it. Some feel only a general sense of sadness or unease. Others report brief flashes of images or sounds, and a few have had experiences similar to mine, though typically shorter in duration and less intense. The site seems to be selective about how much information it provides to different visitors, perhaps calibrating the experience based on what each person can handle psychologically. I maintain a database of these reports, documenting patterns and correlations, slowly building a comprehensive understanding of how these trauma-imprinted landscapes operate. The work continues, with new sites being identified and documented, each one adding to our understanding of the scope of violence that shaped Washington's settlement period. The history we were taught in schools, the narrative of peaceful westward expansion and mutually beneficial treaties, is being challenged by the testimony of landscapes themselves. Places that refuse to let the truth be forgotten, even when humans try to erase it. I carry the weight of over 100 deaths now. The memories of people whose names weren't preserved in written records, but whose suffering was so profound that the earth itself recorded their final moments. It's destroying me slowly, this accumulation of trauma. But it's also the most important work I've ever done. Giving voice to the voiceless and ensuring that genocidal violence can't be hidden simply by excluding it from official documentation. If you're interested in more stories like these, stories about the places where something went terribly wrong and left a permanent mark, stories about the darkness that lurks in America's forgotten places and the truths that history tried to bury, subscribe to Verified Fears. We explore the real horror that exists not in fiction, but in the documented truth of what humans have done to each other, and what happens when the land itself refuses to forget.